Commissioner, thank you for being here today. We show you registered as Mike Morath on behalf of the Texas Education Agency. And you'll be testifying today to brief this committee on the state of public education in Texas. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right, sir. You may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members. Again, this is Mike Morath with Texas Education Agency. In front of you is a 400-slide presentation that I'll spend 4 hours on. It's actually shorter than that, but I'm going to try to go through it as quickly as I can. We'll start with slide 2, which just gives some high-level information about numbers in public education. So you have roughly 5.5 million students. You can see 371,000 teachers. Just for clarity, that is 371,000 full-time equivalent. So if you actually count the number of humans that are teachers, it's about 385,000. 9,000 campuses, 1,200 school systems from around the state. 62% of our kids are economically disadvantaged. For clarification, that means they are eligible for a free or reduced priced lunch. 23% are referred to as emergent bilingual. That is the term in Texas law for students who do not speak English as a first language. And you can see a breakdown on the racial demographics in our schools. We are the largest educator of rural school children in the United States. The state of Texas is, and there's I think about 800,000 of our kids that are in rural schools. So the next slide gives you some statistics about different learning options for kids, both in public and in non-public schools in the state of Texas. There are about 6.2. It says 6.2. We checked the math on this. About 6.3 million. Individuals of kindergarten through 12th grade age in Texas. And so what you'll see at the bottom 2 rows is there's about 286,000 kids that are in private school in Texas and 500,000 kids in homeschool in Texas. We don't have regulatory oversight over those two, and the statistics come from other sources, but thought that was useful for the committee. You also see about 230,000 kids are being educated in an ISD other than their ISD of residence. So these are students who are exercising some form of transfer. There's 420,000 kids that are in public charter schools. And then you have virtual and hybrid schools, most of which are operated by ISDs. I think 1 charter, maybe 2 charter operates them. So just a frame of reference for where students are. In terms of how well the students are doing, well, we keep track of that a couple of different ways. The predominant way is the STAR test, which I heard may be going the way of the dodo. And so we have a tracking mechanism of this. From 3rd grade through 8th grade, you can see on this particular slide what the level of student proficiency is in 3rd grade reading, 3rd grade math, 8th grade reading, 8th grade math. We also measure kindergarten readiness. So these are 5-year-olds that get an entry-level pre-literacy diagnostic, and about half of our entering kindergartners are ready for basic lessons in kindergarten. So this it sets up a significant challenge for teachers, as you can imagine. Towards the other end of the age spectrum, you have measures of high school completion. So 90% of our kids graduate in 4 years from a Texas public high school. The bar immediately before that, though, shows the percentage of kids that have graduated ready for college, career, or the military within that subset. And then the last bar that you see is 6 years after high school graduation. What percentage of our graduates have gone on to earn either a bachelor's degree, associate's degree, or some sort of meaningful trade credential, like a welding certificate, say, from TSTC. And so that number is 36%. So again, this gives you sort of a high-level picture of outcomes. There's more detailed longitudinal data on STAR in particular in the appendix. One thing I thought I would draw your attention to is not state-specific data, but is national data, and that you see on slide 6. This is a data set that uses the NAEP, and so some background on the NAEP. The NAEP is a random sample assessment given to a subset of students in every state in the country in 4th grade reading and math, in 8th grade reading and math. And so we use NAEP as a barometer for how well the state is doing relative to other states. I think we've also provided you a copy of our annual report, which has some more information on NAEP. But this particular graph is meant to highlight something that we do think there is a relationship between, and I know that there's policymakers that are considering this issue in front of the legislature. What we've done is we've normed every NAEP test to the same scale, just to make it easier to see when NAEP peaked in the United States. And this is not Texas data, this is US data, and then how that has changed. And what you can see is that NAEP generally peaked in 2013, except for fourth grade reading when it peaked in 2015. But since then, everywhere in the country, student achievement has been declining. And there's a lot of pontification as to why that is, but what we also overlaid on this is the volume of the smartphone market in the United States over the same time period. And then there's a set of research reports on the left that you're welcome to explore. We do think that there is some relationship between smartphone use generally and certainly smartphone use in schools and student achievement, and we think that relationship is extremely harmful. So anyways, that's information I thought of relevance for the committee. Moving on, school finance. So on slide 8, you get a picture of all-in funding on school finance, and this is sometimes very difficult to get an all-in funding picture. Your LBB reports are generally going to be focused on just legislative appropriations, which misses the property tax component of the school finance system. So what we have done, and in fact there's a requirement for us in the General Appropriations Act to produce a whole series of reports that provide transparency related to district finances. We look at audited financial statements of the districts and add all the numbers up. And so this is the best information we have on per pupil funding all in the state of Texas. Again, I think also just a small caveat, about $100 of this is what you would call state oversight. So think of TEA and the service centers, but the rest of this is actually in district budgets. And so the blue bar is state appropriations, the gray bar is property taxes, the green bar is federal funds. You can see a big increase in the size of that green bar between the 21 and 22 school years. That is the result of the one-time infusion of resources from the federal government, and that resource has dried up. So the year that we are sitting in, districts have largely exhausted those, not entirely, but largely exhausted that one-time funding. And so districts are looking at a reduction in federal funding for the year that we are in. But state and local funding has been steadily increasing in a raw dollar perspective. You'll notice we highlight a distinction between INS funding versus M&O, just so you can see how big that is as a driver. And then we have overlaid on here as a frame of reference an adjustment for inflation. We've overlaid an adjustment for inflation based on a CPI calculation, I think anchored at the 2010-2011 school year.
Commissioner, Vice Chair Bernal has a quick question just for clarification.
Yes, sir. Just because I think, as the chairman said, there's new people here, you may want to explain what M&O and INS is.
Great question.
I mean, just because,
yeah.
so we're all literally on the same page.
Let's, to do that, let's look at the next slide, slide 9. There are, I think broadly speaking, there are 3 predominant buckets of funding in a school district's budget. There's M&O, which stands for maintenance and operations. This is the funding to run the joint on an annual basis. There's INS, which is interest and sinking fund, and specifically that is annual payments to debt service for the buildings that the school district has built. Districts get that, charters do not, just as a frame of reference.
That's the bond money.
That's the bond money.
That's not classroom money.
That's correct. And then there's federal funds. And federal funds, there's actually many different federal programs. Other than the one-time federal infusion related to COVID money, the largest federal infusion of money is actually not from the Department of Education, it's from the Department of Agriculture, and it's the school lunch program. But there's also money for low-income kids. These are the title programs, and as you'll see, a small amount of money for special education. This is IDEA. There's a few other federal buckets. So the all-in funding picture of a district is sort of different than what you would get if you were functioning in a non-public environment, because if you write a check to somebody, they can kind of spend that money however you want. The money that comes under the school finance system, there's basically buckets that are allocated for different things. So bond money can only be used to pay for buildings. M&O, there's a variety of flexibilities that are available in M&O, but there's components of M&O that are also prescribed. So this little fan, like half pie chart that you see here, highlights just some of the different components of the M&O funding system. So you have the basic allotment, which is really completely flexible funding. You have Tier 2 enrichment, which is also completely flexible money, but it is dependent upon additional property taxes levied by a local school district. You have the small and mid-sized allotment, which is also completely flexible, but it is isolated for small and mid-sized schools. Compensatory education, which is funding only for low-income kids. Special education, funding only for students in special education. CTE, funding only for students in career and technical, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when you get an all-in picture of $15,500, just bear in mind that some of that money has to go to specific places. So that funding base is not actually what educates children. That funding base pays for things that educate children, and the primary things that school districts pay for is teachers. And teachers are the most important in-school factor that impacts student outcomes. So you see on slide 11, this is from a meta-analysis of, 1,000 studies. And the research is quite clear. The most important in-school factor that impacts student outcomes is the teacher in the classroom. All the law and the profits hang on what happens bell to bell. There are other factors that matter. It's just the quality of the teacher in the classroom matters more than all the others. So in some general statistics on the health of the teaching profession, slide 12 gives you a picture of the all-in count of teachers relative to the all-in count of students. So what you'll see is that we currently employ the largest number of teachers than we've ever employed in public school in Texas. This is unusual because at the same time we also have one of the higher attrition rates that we've had, which you'll see on the very next slide. So school districts are wrestling with vacancies, but also we are employing more people than ever before as teachers. These are both simultaneously true. This teacher count has historically grown alongside the growth of enrolled students in public education, but what you'll notice is that relationship began to separate really at the dawn of COVID. So the count of employed teachers continues to grow, even though the student population in public schools has generally stopped growing. The attrition rate you'll see on slide 13, and I want to offer a very specific clarification as to what this is. If you work at the Texas Education Agency and a teacher leaves District A and Campus A and then joins District B and Campus B, we are still happy. That is still a teacher employed in public education. But that first district is not happy at all. That teacher did, in fact, leave that district. So this is, are they still employed in public education as a teacher? If you look at local turnover rates of staff, they're going to be higher than this because they may have left your campus, but if they're still in public education, from a state perspective, that's still a teacher, even though that was a departure in that one school. So just want to make sure you understand the difference between that. But this is, what you see is prior to COVID, we lost about 10% of our teachers per year. The immediate impact of COVID was sort of a freeze, and everyone stayed where they were. This was sort of a broad economic thing that was observed. And then coming out of COVID, we saw a significant increase in departures from the teacher profession. We are coming down off of that high, but we're still higher than our historic averages. The next slide, on slide 14, shows a picture of new teacher hires. So by way of background, the state hires roughly 50,000 new teachers a year, but about 20,000 of those are rehires. So we often think about, you will hear the retired teacher rehire, but this is any kind of rehire. I was a teacher for 5 years in my 20s, I left for 5 years, I came back in my 30s. So about 20,000 of the 50,000 new hires each year are rehires, or came from out-of-state employment as teachers. This chart shows the 30,000 teachers that are hired each year that are new to the teaching profession, and how were they prepared. And what many people think of as teacher preparation, you have this vision in your head. I'm sorry, the graph on slide 14. You have this picture of your head of somebody goes to college, they're in the College of Education, they become a teacher. That is a vanishingly small percentage of where teachers are hired from. That's the dark blue bar. We have seen a growth in residencies. Texas is now the only state in the union that has an approved teacher certification program for a one-year residency. Think medical residencies, you train for a year. We generally think that's the highest quality preparation. That's about 1% of our new hires. Alternative certification is a certification program for many people that it's sort of on-the-job training. You do get certified, but you might not have gotten much preparation before you started. So it's a certification process you typically earn in your first year of employment. And then there's uncertified, which is exactly what you think it is. There's no state oversight, no state certification. There may be no training, there may be great training. It is entirely up to what a local school district decides to do. And so some school districts have very robust, what you would think of as kind of like apprentice models, and they do a lot of preparation. And for others, I had a job opening, I had an application, it was filled, and it's everything in between. So, anyways, what is very unusual, and we do think that this is worthy of policy-making attention, is we have in the last 3 years gone almost entirely to hiring uncertified teachers. You can see the majority of first-year teachers are now uncertified. And to the extent that that is the same as not prepared to enter the teaching profession, we are setting these folks up for a very rough ride, because you will sometimes hear people referred to as, that person was born to teach. I do not think that that is an accurate statement. There are people that are born with many gifts from our Creator. You can have high aptitude, high energy, a lot of passion for children, but no one comes out of the womb knowing how to manage 20 little humans. That takes a lot of time, effort, and training, and you have to know your content area as well. If you're going to teach math, you generally need to know math pretty darn well. So anyways, this I think is an area worthy of significant attention. Let me continue on, again, the broader health of the teaching profession.
Mr.
So
Chairman, can I ask a question? Mike, have you done any forecasting on the decline of population growth and how that how that affects our hiring in the future?
Yes, it's a good.
That's pretty significant.
It is a good question. If you go back to slide 12, you'll notice that the student population net, the state of Texas, stopped growing about 5 years ago. It's a very unusual phenomenon. We as a state continue to grow in our total population, and our enrolled student population in K-12 education is not growing anymore. We have information from the state demographer that we use to project out multiple years. We're projecting largely that the next 5 years for the state of Texas is going to be demographically flat. That's caused by two significant reductions in birth rates, one that happened in the 2009 to 2011 time period as a result of the Great Recession, and one that happened during COVID. And we can see that in the broad numbers. And so there's just not as many little humans relative to the ratio of big humans as there used to be in the state of Texas.
Are there areas like districts where we're losing teachers because of the decline in birth rates?
So
or not?
as a district sees declining enrollment, the district has to make staffing pattern adjustments. But as you can see, writ large, we continue to hire a large number of teachers each year. Some of this, the number of new teacher hires that is needed for the state is not just a relationship of the student population, it's also a relationship of the turnover rate. So if we can do a better job, say, preparing people for the rigors of the classroom so they don't quit by December, if we do a better job supporting teachers both through compensation and non-compensation related practices so they stay in the profession, we will see turnover reduce and therefore need to hire fewer than, say, 50,000 new teachers each year. So on the subject of pay, average teacher pay, as you can see on slide 15, is up. The legislature, as you saw on the school finance slides earlier, the legislature has increased funding generally for public education pretty consistently for the last 10 years. And that has resulted in teacher pay increases also over the last 10 years. But inflation over the same time, certainly in the last roughly 4.5 years, inflation has been at historic highs. And so the average teacher pay is up 15% in the last 5 years, but inflation during the same time period is 24%. So,
Commissioner, real quick, does this number here, does this include teacher incentive allotment?
it does, because we would factor that into overall compensation averages.
Do we have the data on just average teacher pay excluding TIA?
We can run that for you,
All
absolutely.
right,
And now that you say that, I want to double check this, because we get both total teacher compensation, this is inclusive of stipends and everything else, and then we get base pay. Sometimes TIA is not part of base pay, it's part of stipend. So I'll have to double check to make sure this number is inclusive of all compensation and not just base pay. And then we'll get back to you.
Representative Tallarico.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner. So do we have an inflation-adjusted teacher pay number? I'm looking at the slide, and
I don't. I mean, we can calculate pretty easily. So
Okay.
When we verify whether this is all pay or base pay, I'll also then provide you a CPI adjustment for it.
do we know if
Is
it's...
there a year you want to benchmark it to? Because that matters a great deal.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you have a 5-year period here.
So we'll benchmark it to 2019 and go from there. Okay.
Do we have a sense of whether or not it's higher or lower?
Well, I mean, I can tell you it's lower. If pay is up 15%, inflation's up 24%, then real pay's down.
Okay, so the graph, the chart or the line on the graph is going up, but in reality, it's going down.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Everybody lives in raw dollars, but you pay with, milk's a lot more than it used to be.
Thank
All right, Representative Frank.
Commissioner, on slide 14, on the different certified, uncertified teachers, do we have information on how much less successful the uncertified teachers are?
We do.
What the difference is, or is that?
Yeah, we do, and it's pretty stark. I wonder if this is in an appendix slide.
Okay. And if you don't have it now, that's fine. I just would like to see what the long-term differential is.
There are 3 recent studies on this, and in fact, I want to say a study came out today. I don't have that, but Texas Tech has been doing some analysis. But the second to last and third to last slides actually the last and second to last slide in your deck, which is in your appendix, you can see the relationship between density of employment of uncertified teachers and average campus performance. And so the campuses that were in the F range of scale score performance had on average 15.9% uncertified teachers. Campuses that were in the A range of performance had on average 4.7% uncertified teachers. We have other data. It's harmful for students. It causes a reduction in student achievement on average. It's also bad for the adults. They have a much higher turnover rate. They quit at much more frequent rates.
Thank you.
All right, Chairman Leach.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner, for being here. How does an uncertified teacher become certified?
So the certification. This is a great question, and I think again worthy of significant policymaking attention. The state of Texas does not really invest any direct resources in the preparation of teachers. If you look at your Appropriations Act, the budget of the legislature, it's not really subject to public funding. So someone who wishes to be a teacher has to pay all of the costs of becoming a teacher out of their own pocket.
And that's exactly where I was going. What is the cost for an uncertified teacher to become certified?
So if you're probably the cheapest certification options that are available are almost all online asynchronous training programs, and they can run you right at $4,000.
Yeah.
The most robust, if you're going to do a residency program, will probably cost you much closer to $20,000, and that doesn't factor in the fact that you have to work for a year as a resident. So you might have to make a compensation sacrifice during that year as well.
So just to be clear, let's say I've heard some local instances of uncertified teachers who are working to become certified having to pay $5,000 out of their own pockets.
That is correct. Absolutely.
And the process being several months, maybe a year long, and so an uncertified teacher is having to make the decision to
choose to get certified or not.
To choose to get certified or not, and to pay $5,000, essentially to take a $5,000 pay cut for a year.
And in most cases, they don't actually get any kind of compensation increase once they obtain certification.
Correct.
So there's really no reason for them to do this.
That's my ultimate question: is has the state made any sort of investment, or local districts, any local districts that you know of, making any sort of investment, proactive investment to make sure uncertified teachers have the incentive to get certified?
Yeah, local districts are definitely taking action on this, but not all of them. So I'm aware of a district in the chairman's backyard that they have invested local funds to help current uncertified teachers become certified. I do, and so this is happening. It's not happening everywhere, clearly, otherwise we wouldn't see the number of uncertified teachers that we see. I will also say that there's a really big difference between I've already hired you as a teacher and after the fact you get certified versus before you started being a teacher of record, you're getting prepared to teach. So sort of on-the-job certification puts them in the certification system, and actually this has student safety implications because we generally have oversight to sanction someone's certificate. But if they're uncertified, we have no ability, barring 3 specific circumstances, to put them, say, on a don't pass the trash, do not hire registry. So there's actually some other implications of certification beyond preparation. But certification is not the same thing as preparation. Preparation is really important. Certification is also important. I could go on at length at this topic, but that's.
Dr. Allen?
Yes. Slide 15.
Yes,
Page
ma'am.
15. The teacher pay, and the line goes up on the diagram, is up to $62,000. Thank you. Up to $62,000. What is the base pay given to districts by the state?
So the state does not mandate specifics related to the compensation of teachers other than the state minimum salary schedule, which everyone is way above.
Yeah, what's the minimum salary?
The minimum salary in state law is $33,600. So, and there may be 3 teachers in the state of Texas at that minimum salary. Everyone typically pays way above the state minimum salary.
So that up above the 33,000 comes from property taxes?
All of this money comes from the school finance system. So the school finance system, the first funding is property taxes, the second funding is state appropriations. Some districts it's entirely property taxes, some districts there's barely any property taxes. But yes, they're paying for teachers out of their M&O budget. That's what they're paying for teachers out of.
Thank you.
Commissioner, real quick for the benefit of the committee, if I recall, an uncertified teacher, and this is I think it's in our annual report as well, in an uncertified teacher in a classroom that had no experience either as a paraprofessional, I believe that students not only didn't learn, but they actually backed up. There was learning loss.
Yeah,
and the attendance rate is typically lower in that classroom.
That is exactly right. In fact, we now have confirmed.
It may be in the appendix, but I didn't see it.
We now have confirmed the attendance rate difference, which is on your very last slide.
All
A new teacher that is certified, the average student absence rate is 5.5%. A new teacher that is uncertified, the average student absence rate is 6.5%. So that's not the same thing as causality. That could be correlative, but
It's interesting, though.
that's an important factor.
All right.
Okay, let me continue. Slide 16, just continue on the subject of compensation. You asked about teacher incentive allotment. So teachers that receive the teacher incentive allotment generally receive about $11,000 above what you would normally expect. So if you think average pay for teachers is 62, average pay for TIA teachers is much closer to the 70s, and you have a decent number of TIA teachers that are actually now above the 6-figure mark. So the teacher incentive allotment is a sort of robustly structured portion of the foundation school program that one is directly goes to teacher compensation. So 90% of TIA money has to go to teacher compensation. So we have seen a significant increase in both the number of districts that wish to participate in and are participating in TIA and the number of teachers that are being designated. So we think in the year that we sit, we'll have about 25,000 designated teachers out of the 380,000 teachers statewide. We would project that number to continue to grow up and up and up over the coming years. We're happy to share with projections on that. TIA teachers generally have an 8% higher retention rate than non-TIA designated teachers, and TIA teachers have a higher student growth factor than non-TIA teachers.
Vice Chair Bernal.
Just real quick, I think the numbers on TIA and the number of teachers that are part of it relative to the total amount is helpful. But could you put that in context of districts? Because it's a district decision whether or not to do the TIA. So how many districts are doing it relative to the number of districts we have?
Let me see if I have that handy. I mean, it's in the several hundreds now. I don't know if we've crossed the 400 mark or the 500 mark at this point. We do have that information. I just don't know if I have it.
But if you're ballparking it, you're saying that there's about 400 to 500 districts that do it
Out of 1,200 total
1,200.
LEAs. That's
Okay.
right. Yeah, and there are administrative hurdles with becoming, oh, thank you, here we go. 597 districts that are in the sort of pool right now. So that's about half. And it's growing sort of like a hockey stick.
Okay. Representative Hinojosa.
Commissioner Morath, what percentage of teachers are getting TIA?
Well, again, you can, the math would be 25,000 out of about 380,000. So as in the year that we sit.
Okay, I think last legislative session, it was 1% of teachers.
Well, yeah, because it was only, last legislative session, you would have been sitting here in this similar hearing, and that number was only about 4,000 teachers, not 25,000 teachers. So it's expanding very rapidly.
Expanding, but still a small fraction of our total teacher population in the state of Texas.
Yeah, currently 25 out of 380, whatever that fraction is, that's going to be less than 10%. Yeah.
Representative Tallarico.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'm one of the few members on the dais who was here in 2019 when we did House Bill 3, and I'm a big fan of TIA. I've talked to educators who are participating in the program, but it does feel like every session we come here, we talk about TIA, and it's still a pretty small number. I'm encouraged by the jump. I'm curious why that jump occurred, and what are the barriers that are still in place preventing districts and teachers from participating? Because 6%, to Rep. Hinojosa's point, is still a very small percentage of our.
That's right. So in order to participate in TIA, a district essentially has to meet standards of validity and reliability in their evaluation of teachers. A different way of saying that is you have to have a fair teacher evaluation system. Without TIA, you're welcome to have an unfair teacher evaluation system. But with TIA, you must have a fair teacher evaluation system. And so what I mean by that is that the statute requires both an observation of performance and some evaluate a way to determine how well the students have grown academically, which is different than how well they perform academically. This is growth. And so each district has total flexibility as to how they define that. But generally, if you think about an observation of performance, you need to have two different people that can walk into a teacher's classroom and draw the same conclusion. If it's not calibrated in that way, it's really easy for it to be an unfair system. And so we require them to meet standards of fairness in the way that they observe. I should say statute does, and we enforce this, way that we observe performance. And then they have to have some way of determining how well the students are growing. And so the barrier to implementation is a district has to go through that calibration process with all of their evaluators and make sure that everyone's trained on a rubric, there's an evidence base, the teachers understand the rubric, the evaluators understand the rubric, people draw the same conclusion. And then they have to go through a process of how are we going to determine how well the students have learned the material over the course of the year. And that, you can imagine, in PE looks very different, elementary PE than it looks in high school CTE, than it looks in 7th grade math. So theoretically, I think you would presume that all districts are doing this without TIA. I would say in practice that's not happening sort of with consistent quality controls. And so TIA sort of ensures that the district has quality controls. They have to send their stuff to Texas Tech that runs a bunch of correlation analysis to verify it. What we would suggest is some additional administrative support to the districts to help them do this. There's always an emphasis on let's getting resources to the classroom, to classroom teachers, but having a fair appraisal system, it takes overhead. And a district the size of Austin, a district the size of San Vicente, very different central offices. And so I think the legislature would be wise to provide some kind of funding to support district administration of TIA. And I think if you offer that and offer that broadly, then you'll have a lot more districts that are in it. And then the districts that are in it, instead of, say, 25% of their positions being eligible for consideration, they would have 100% of their positions eligible for consideration.
So is this jump that we see in the 22-23 school year, is that a jump in the number of districts that are participating or the number of teachers within currently participating?
Yeah, it's both. It's reflective. The more districts that participate, clearly then they're going to designate the teachers that they can designate in their districts. Sometimes what happens is a district will get in a relatively small approach. They will have only certain grades and subjects eligible for participation in TIA. We want to encourage them to have all of their teachers eligible. And so what might happen is year one, it's 40% of teaching roles are eligible. In year three, it's 80% of teaching roles. In year five, it's 100%. This is the reason why I think some administrative support to help districts get in more rapidly and to make it as broad as possible inside the district will speed up adoption.
And do you attribute this jump to, I know I think it was the 21 session, we removed the requirement that the teachers participating be certified?
No, I don't think that has anything to do with it. I think this is actually, if you think TIA was passed by the legislature in 2019, it took a couple of years for districts to understand, okay, this is what we've got to do it. And then you had your early adopters, and then only after the early adopters get in there do their teachers get designated. So this is somewhat the anticipated slow but rapid curved increase that I think was in the discussions when House Bill 3 was passed in 2019 initially. So this is what I would say is an expected adoption curve from the policymaking conversation going back to 2019.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chairman.
Yeah, Commissioner, first of all, TIA in my district, there are several districts that are either in the queue or others that are doing it. It's very, very popular. A couple of things that I hear when I talk to teachers across the state is that it's difficult to validate and get a program running, even when you're doing it for, quote, the tested subjects. I would also argue there are many other teachers on campus who are doing great work where it's a little bit harder to find the metric. And what I'm told is that if you have a program stood up for your tested subjects, if you go back to try to rope in all the other outstanding teachers in other subjects, if that invalidates it, it invalidates the whole program. I don't know if that is what I've been told.
I think that is true.
I would love to see the agency come up with some best practices and a framework for how a choir teacher, theater arts, I mean, everything from, some of our CTE folks they're really impacting kids' lives where they could participate as well. Because I think there is, fine arts, for instance, you can track fine arts participation to SAT scores and ACT scores and other things. And I think districts could really use some guidance because they don't want to lose what they have, but they're leaving a lot of teachers out and a lot of teachers that are really important, to what, to kids' academic success ultimately. And that, I think they could use some assistance on that. And that's just my one comment.
Yeah, I totally agree. I do actually believe we do provide sort of templates. So there's hundreds of districts that are in it now, including districts that have 100% of teachers that are evaluated. So we have models for how this works. Okay. And so we do provide that kind of technical assistance to districts. But we provide that with our team of 6 or something at TEA. And what you generally need is a shoulder partner with you in the superintendent sort of working through these issues. Yeah. Which is one of the reasons why I think some degree of administrative support for districts will allow them to then take advantage of those technical assistance templates that we have and then more speedily adopt.
Yeah, I think that's really important that we make sure that whatever we do on TIE this session, that we include that and that administrative support, really whether you're, certainly in the smaller districts, but even the larger districts, it can be a really heavy lift to try to include the teachers that really are outshining. They're the shining stars of the campus and want to make sure they're included.
Completely agree.
Yeah, all right, thank you.
So moving past TIA, slide 17, Governor Abbott asked us to convene a teacher vacancy task force 3 years ago, I believe, and this was the set of recommendations that came out of the task force. Really want to commend the teachers and administrators that were part of that group. Many of their recommendations are not policy recommendations, they're practice recommendations, things that local school districts can do. But many of their recommendations are also policy recommendations. And so we have this report on our website, happy to share it with the entirety of the committee. Some of their recommendations have been acted on by the legislature, but some of them have not. And so would encourage you to pay attention to this because improving the health and efficacy of the teaching profession is in part about money, but it is more than money. Many of our teachers report that they will regularly work 70+ hours a week in part because the job that they have been given has been engineered to require a human to work 70 hours a week, which is unfair. And this is something that the teacher doesn't have any ability to adjust. This is a campus principal, superintendent, district leadership team that has to change the job duties and better sort of organize what's happening on the campus. So you'll see things related to that in the teacher vacancy task force recommendations. I heard the chairman refer to discipline. This comes up with some frequency, but you have campuses in Texas that have really very few complaints related to discipline from the adults and the parents. And then you have campuses on the other end of the spectrum that have very significant challenges. So again, a lot of that comes down to local implementation. So some of the teacher vacancy task force are policy recommendation, and they're useful broadly, which I would include discipline in that category, but some of them are also local and sort of managerial in nature.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, Representative Bryant.
Mr. Morath, what is the appropriate pay level for a teacher in an urban area like Houston or Dallas?
That's a fantastic question, and it's somewhat impossible. Let me answer this question with a study that was done on the net present value of a kindergarten teacher that was high performing, and the impact that kindergarten teacher has on the economy. Every single year, if a kindergarten teacher is performing at a high level, that teacher is responsible for roughly $400,000 of GDP gain in the economy long term. So if you think about the impact that teachers have, they're worth their weight in gold. So we sort of start with that. In terms of the level of pay, there's any number of factors that you have to consider. What's cost of living? What's necessary from a retention standpoint? What's necessary if you think about commensurate jobs in the economy? I think about teachers, highly skilled teachers, the same way I think about doctors, and we pay doctors a whole lot more than we pay teachers, generally speaking. So I don't know that there is one answer to the question. I will say there's big differences between, say, a 22-year-old starting, no experience, 35-year-old, highly experienced, huge track record of success. So I think there's some daylight there that would be a part of the answer to your question.
I'm looking for the answer.
Yeah,
I'm asking you, how much money should we be paying a teacher in Dallas? And you can break it down into beginners and advanced and all that if you choose, or even by grades, but asking how much should we be paying them?
I think Dallas has a relatively effective compensation system. I think starting teachers in Dallas are in the low 60s, and the highest performing teachers in Dallas are at 110. And so those are pretty good wages. But you're talking to the Commissioner of Education, and I would always love teachers to be paid more. So regardless what the number is.
Well, this kind of piggybacks on the same question I asked you 2 years ago when I was a member of the Appropriations Committee and you came before us, and I asked you how much money we should be spending on a per student basis, ADA basis statewide, and I couldn't get an answer.
Yes, sir.
Now, you're a former school board member.
Yes, sir.
In Dallas, right? And at the present time, you're in direct control of the whole Houston Independent School District. Isn't that correct?
We have an appointed board of managers there.
Okay. How much money do you think they should be paid in Houston? Now, you're in charge, so what should be the pay level in Houston?
Again, when I think about the level of differentiation of compensation that exists in Dallas, you've got starting teachers making in the low 60s. You've got the highest performing teachers making 110. I think that kind of spectrum makes a lot of sense in a lot of places. If we can do it higher than that, then that's even better. But I don't think you're asking me a very complex question and you want a simple answer, and I can't give you a simple answer to a complex question.
Well, I'm not looking for a simple answer, but I'm looking to the Commissioner of Education and the Texas Education Agency, with all the people you have over there and all the resources, to give us well-informed advice about what the teacher pay should be. All of us here are part-time legislators. We work for a living and get paid $600 a month to be here.
Thank
so
you for
we
your
don't have
service.
time to be experts. So You have a large department, which, as I remember from 2 years ago, but at that time had increased its budget by 40% over the last few years. So I'm just asking you for advice on a critical issue, and that is how much should teachers be paid in the various districts that we have, all of which have different characteristics. You're well equipped to figure that out and make a recommendation to us.
Then I would, to the extent that you want to, an answer without any caveats, I think that the compensation that is provided to teachers in Dallas would be a great model for us to look at for the state, and to the extent that we can use that as a baseline and go up from there, that is also a great approach.
Thank you.
Representative Hinojosa.
Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner Morath, I seem to recall in the TEA's interim study from, not after last session, but the one before, there was an amount, and I want to say it was about 10,000, that was the difference between what teachers are compensated and what like professions with like degrees are compensated. Do you remember
I don't
what that
recall
is?
that study. I'm very familiar with the concept, and yeah, if you think about an individual with like skill, the market in the broader economy tends to compensate them more than what you see on average. And for teachers, this is a dilemma.
And I think that, well, for me, that is the challenge with being so focused on the teacher incentive allotment, is that generally base pay is too low in this state. I had a teacher in my office a couple of weeks ago. Well, I had several teachers, and repeatedly I heard the story of schools losing teachers to other professions because pay wasn't where it should be. I had this one teacher tell me a story. We were all in tears by the end. She said, I was in this classroom, a fourth grade classroom that was missing the teacher because the teacher had left. And I took the student's notebook, and at the top of the student's notebook was the teacher's name crossed out, another teacher's name crossed out, another teacher's name crossed out. And here this student was on their fourth teacher for that class. And so that is unacceptable. And one of the, I mean, if you look at the teacher incentive allotment, there's some articles on it, there's Reddit threads on it. There's a lot of complaints with teachers in the system with teacher incentive allotment. There's complaints about the evaluations not being fair and teachers feeling like perhaps they were docked a few points just to not have to get the bonus. There are teachers feeling like because it's made public to everyone how much they're making.
Good Monday
That
morning
is
to
kind of
everybody.
humiliating. To have that be public for everyone to see, I'm making so much more or I'm not making as much as someone else, especially in an environment that needs to be collaborative, right? Campuses where there's only one teacher who's getting it and everybody kind of feels a certain way about that teacher. So I would like us to really look at what base pay looks like for teachers across the state, because that is something that will help all teachers and I think help tremendously with our turnover rate as well.
Vice Chair Bernal.
Thank you. Two things. In the elegance of the House's scheduling, Ways and Means starts in 3 minutes, and I've got to go and check in, and then I'll be back, so don't take that personally. Second of all, in the Dallas numbers that you gave, the 110, I'm assuming, is a TIA teacher.
Yeah, they're the highest ranked, highest
Right.
performing.
So-
there's actually, believe it or not, there's compensation on top of that for stipends and stuff like that. This is
Right.
their salary schedule.
So in Dallas, we've got the base pay starting at 60,
It's probably 62 or somewhere
62,
near there
right.
for a novice starting teacher.
22 years old, awesome. It's a TIA district, so that's where the 110 comes from. One of the things that we've heard about, and I think Rep. Hinojosa was talking about, is without TIA, where do teachers in Dallas, and you can use another district if you want, sort of top off?
Yeah, it's a
Because
good question.
The gap there is close to $40,000, but without TIA, what does that look like?
Yeah, Dallas is somewhat unique in that they do not use the traditional salary schedule. So the salary schedule that I think everybody on this dais is going to be familiar with is 0 years experience, this is your pay. 1 year of experience, this is your pay. 2 years of experience, this is your pay. 3 years of experience, this is your pay. It doesn't, performance is irrelevant to that. It's just, this is what the sort of pay schedule is. So Dallas, even before TIA was a thing in the legislature, modified its salary schedule so its starting teachers are all classified as novice, and then everyone is subjected to a performance review, and they have a progressing, proficient, exemplary master, and they built that before TIA was a thing. So TIA is essentially a funding source for the entirety of their compensation system, and performance, and as teachers' performance goes up, their pay goes up with it, even people who are starting out as teachers. So that is different than the typical TIA district, because the typical TIA district, it's just you're on the credible years of service salary schedule. You're going to get whatever that salary schedule raise is. That, you know, rain falls on all, the just and unjust alike. And then if you get designated, you get this bolt-on compensation on top of it. So that's a little bit of a different system.
Thank you.
Commissioner, I know we didn't have ratings, what's Dallas ISD rated as a district?
I am enjoined from the courts from issuing an A through F rating on any district for the last 2 years.
Well, I've never had that response. That's interesting, but it's safe to say it's a lower urban district that is doing very well. If you talk to folks in Dallas.
Yeah, and we have raw performance information we release on our website that you can look up. I'm happy to show you. There's a one way that we analyze performance, which is akin to how it happens in Domain 2 of the accountability system, is what's referred to as relative performance. So Highland Park has 0% poverty. Dallas has about 90%, probably 87% poverty. So we run a process to sort of norm out the effects of poverty and then see how well the students are doing. And so Dallas is in the top quartile of performance, top quintile of performance, I think, statewide.
Okay. And so, okay, well, that gets a whole other question about the being enjoined or whatever it is. Anyway, for those in the audience who would like to follow along with the presentation handouts today, they've been posted to Texas Legislature online alongside our committee posting if you'd like to follow along in the crowd. All right, continue.
Okay, moving, so teachers, the most important in-school factor impacting student outcomes. It is absolutely worthy of this committee to devote the majority of your policymaking attention to how we can improve support and the health of the teaching profession and efficacy of teaching in school. There are other things, however, that you need to have on your radar. So the next section of slides is devoted to special education in Texas. So slide 19 is a bar chart. And I think it is just useful to show how significant the broad change in special education has happened in Texas over the last decade. So many of you will recall the feds issued us a letter in 2017, 18, 19, that time range, indicating that our school districts and our state was out of compliance with the requirements of IDEA. This resulted in a lot of legislative attention and a lot of regulatory attention. And as one of the most important changes is that the state became much better at child find, which is a very narrow term. This is the process of determining whether a student is eligible, whether a student has a disability and is eligible for individualized education plans or programs to support their instruction. And so what you see on slide 19 is that we currently have 14% of our student population. Actually, as we stand, it's higher than that. But last year, we had 14% of our student population that was identified and receiving special education services. And a decade ago, it was 8.5%. So this has been a massive increase in the number of students receiving special education supports. It is not the same thing as a massive increase in underlying disability conditions among students. So I want to sort of draw a distinction between that. That could be true. There could be underlying changes in student disability conditions, but what we think predominantly the state has become is much better at identifying yes, you do have a disability that you are entitled to special education supports, and now those students are receiving them. So that is the good news. The bad news is the operational challenge that this causes inside of school districts, and you can see that summed up in the resource page on slide 20. So the Special Education Finance Commission was a commission of this legislature 3 years ago. This is an updated version of a chart that was presented in that Special Education Finance Commission. I want to just explain this chart. We're going to this blue and yellow bar chart, just make sure everybody's on the same page. These are two different school years. One school year is 2017, one school year is 2020. The blue bar this is how much dedicated revenue that goes to school districts solely for the purposes of special education. And there's really three primary funding sources that they get. The biggest one by far is the legislative funding formulas, the SPED funding formulas under the Foundation School Program. They also receive IDEA funds, and then SHARS we generally think of as an insurance reimbursement program that covers special education expenditures. So that's the blue bar, and you can see funding is way up. 2017, 2022, funding is way up. But the gold bar is the other side of the equation. Districts, they follow generally accepted accounting rules. There's a bunch of sort of accounting details they do, and they keep track of special education expenditures. We roll this up. We can see this in their financial statements. So the gold bar is what they have indicated they are spending on direct special education services. And there's they're coded as federal expenditures and state expenditures, but there's really no reason to think about those differently. And what you will see is that there's a deficit. It was $1.2 billion per year in 2017, meaning that districts in 2017 spent $1.2 billion more delivering special education to students than they received in terms of special education revenues from a combination of the state and federal government. And then that deficit is actually larger now. And so even though revenue is up, expenses are up at a higher level. And so the deficit is roughly $1.7 billion per year. I know everyone is used to thinking about biennial numbers, but this is a per year deficit. So what this does not mean is students are not getting those special education expenditures. These would not be expenditures if districts were not spending the money. What it does mean is districts are pulling from a different funding bucket in that M&O pie slice that you saw earlier to cover these special education costs. And they're generally taking from general education resources, say the basic allotment, to spend on special education. So this is an updated version of a slide that was presented during the School Finance Commission a few years ago. The School Finance Commission did have a set of policy recommendations, a statute that you would need to adopt. I do think a couple of these are worthy of talking through in some detail. At the core of the Special Education Finance Commission's recommendation was a change in the way the formulas work. That's not the same thing as putting more money in the formulas, and I would certainly advocate for you to put more money in the formulas. There's a $1.7 billion annual deficit. But the way that the current law works is sort of visualized on this slide 21, these cute little graphics. These are two students that are both educated in a mainstream setting, but they are both special education students. Student A gets modified tests, has a one-on-one aid, small group testing, and a behavioral intervention plan. Student B has joint lesson planning done with a general ed teacher who is not part of that direct, and a special education teacher who doesn't come to the classroom directly. Those are both special education students. You can tell right off the bat the cost differences are pretty stark between the services required for student B and the services required for student A. And under current state law, districts receive the exact same dollar amount for both of these kids. So even if you put $1.7 billion per year into the system, if you don't put them in different formulas, you're going to create significant cost revenue asymmetry inside of districts. And so the core of recommendation number one was to better match revenue with expenditure in the way the school finance formulas work. So I am a state employee. I am neither in favor nor opposed to any piece of filed legislation. However, I do think that this is worthy of policymaking attention by this body. Because it is a significant operational challenge for districts. Continuing down that road, The slide 22 is the recommendation from the School Finance Commission. It's recommendation number 2, and it's the cost of evaluation. And so this requires a little bit of background. When a student, when either a parent or an educator suspects a student of having a disability, that student is entitled to be formally evaluated. Sometimes you might suspect a student of having a disability and there may be no underlying disability. It may be actually a problem of instructional delivery that has been inadequate prior to that point. For example, in 5th grade, if you cannot read, is that because you are dyslexic, or is that because you have not received adequate reading instruction? So again, one of the purposes of the evaluation is to determine whether there is an underlying disability. The evaluation process is robust. There's highly specialized staff members that do this, and it will cost somewhere between $1,000 and $5,000 per student to conduct an evaluation. Whether the student then comes back and says, yes, you have a disability, or no, you do not have a disability, under either case, the district receives no direct funds for the conduct of that evaluation. And they are obligated to do those evaluations. They are obligated to do those evaluations both for public students and for private school students. And they incur that cost, but they have no direct revenue associated with it. That is part of the $1.7 billion deficit. That is clearly part of it. The commission had a recommendation to create a dedicated funding stream for those evaluations. It does seem logical to me, just drawing your attention to that particular recommendation. There were other commission recommendations that you can see listed on slide 23. I'm happy to go into any of these in detail.
Representative Hinojosa has a question.
Yes, ma'am.
For clarification, did you say that we are currently paying for that evaluation, or that's one of the recommendations?
One of the recommendations. There's no state funding to cover the evaluation.
Okay, and I wholeheartedly support that. I've told the story about my son had to wait for a year to get evaluated because we didn't have enough paid professionals in the district to do those evaluations, and we had to pay out of pocket about $2,000 ourselves to get that evaluation done. And that's a big problem in the district I represent. The district I represent, Austin, is also one of the districts with one of the higher percentages or a higher number of the SPED program not paid for by the state. In other words, our deficit is bigger than other school districts. And I have heard that it's not as bad for the school districts that get the small and mid-size allotment. Do you have any insight into that?
So we have a report. There was a report done during the SPED Finance Commission that I'll have to rustle up, but this is ringing a bell. The larger the district, the more likely they were going to be in a deficit in SPED, and then the bigger the deficit. The smaller the district, the less likely they were going to be in a deficit related to SPED, meaning their dedicated SPED revenues might have been sufficient to cover their dedicated SPED costs, but in all of the bigger districts, the deficits are very large.
Okay, if you could get us some data on that.
I'll track down that
in particular, especially since in the school finance bill, it's my understanding that we're trying to increase small and mid-sized allotment. I would like to see how SPED funding factors into that. One thing that I keep hearing from teachers in the district that I represent is that they are seeing a much greater percentage of kids in their classroom with who need special education, and not commensurate with the increase in the state. I just heard from teachers with like 30% of their kids in their class needing special education. And I'm trying to get to the bottom of why that is. I saw some statewide numbers on charter schools that show that they serve about 29% fewer overall SPED kids than ISDs. The only thing I can think of is that because the surrounding charter schools aren't taking those kids for whatever reason, that there's a greater percentage of them in the ISDs. Do you have any insight into that?
I think there are differences in SPED representation between the two segments of public education. That is true. I don't have the data, but I don't have any reason to doubt the statistic that you shared. There is a high degree of variation in terms of SPED representation rates from one school to the next, and sometimes from one classroom to the next. There are identifying why in any given reason is going to be highly specific to that case, but We do see some behavior where, let's say that there's a reputation of a particular school that's, hey, this school is amazing for autism or amazing for dyslexia. What will happen is parents will begin to sort of choose that school knowing its reputation for that particular disability support, and so then you see these higher representation ratios. So that is part of some of the difference. I don't think that explains all of it.
It would make sense to me that if you have charter schools with such a lower percentage of taking kids with special education, that then you would see a higher percentage of them in the ISDs. And so,
I mean, just simple averages,
right,
certainly.
so is there a plan, or do you all have, that hurts our ISDs because those are classrooms with bigger challenges, right? You have a critical mass of more challenging to educate kids, again, with a bigger funding deficit. And I think the SPED funding deficit is the largest in the whole school finance system. So it seems like we need a plan to get a hold of that issue.
Yeah, I mean, I would have two sort of immediate reactions to that. One, we don't force a parent to go to a school. They choose to go to the school, and so to the extent that parents have selected to go to a given school and there's less or more of a given student represented, that's gonna happen without coercion by the state.
But we don't know if that's why. We don't know if that's what's going on.
But the other issue is, to the extent that you can address in the school finance formulas a better way to match revenue to cost, it significantly reduces any sort of disparity that you can see. So for example, if you modified your school finance formulas to put a whole lot of money in special education supports, a campus that has very low special education representation will get none of that new money. It will instead go to other campuses that have the higher special education representation and then the higher cost. So I do think it is wise for you to think through this from a school finance angle for sure.
Do you have a plan to look at why the percentage is so much lower in charter schools?
Well, so this happens as a matter of course. So our oversight, not just of charter schools in particular, but of public schools writ large, includes both the cyclical monitoring and intensive monitoring of special education compliance. So if we can discern that there is some aspect of non-compliance related to enrollment rejection, which is not really allowed, or lack of service delivery, we generally find that in our monitoring processes, and then we issue corrective action plans up to and including conservators.
Thank you.
Chairman Dutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know we don't do a very good job of evaluating SPED students, but what's our responsibility after the evaluation?
So for a student who has been given a special education evaluation, the most immediate thing to happen is an admission review and dismissal committee convenes to determine whether or not there is a special education service that can support that disability. Because it's actually, there's scenarios where a student could come back and have a bona fide disability, but it can't be addressed educationally, in which case that student then does not start receiving special education services. That's rare, but it occurs. So essentially the next step is to build a plan for what kind of individualized education supports are going to be provided to that student. There's a protocol that districts follow under federal law to how to build that plan, and then they are obligated to follow that plan. And if they do not follow that plan, then the parents have due process rights to seek what's referred to as compensatory education. And that term is confusing because we have something else in the state called compensatory education, which is a different thing. So, if you are required to provide the education to that student in special education, that has been documented in that IEP, and if you don't, there are enforcement mechanisms to ensure strict compliance.
If that assessment means that a child needs some medical attention, for example, do we have the responsibility to provide that?
You have now outstripped my knowledge of what happens in special education, so let me phone a friend.
There has to be an educational need.
The special education obligation is specifically educational, not medical.
So, well, as an example, if the child had a vision problem, what we have the responsibility to do is to evaluate that and identify that, but beyond that, that's as far as we would go.
So as it turns out, I think there are different state laws on vision screening, and so students do get universally vision screened under state law, independent of special education. And I think under that, I have to go back and check how that law works, but you're generally obligated to do something about it. You at least tell the parent, hey, the kid needs glasses, and often many districts will then work with nonprofits or others to ensure that the kid receives vision correction.
And so, for example, dyslexia screening would determine whether the child suffers from dyslexia.
Yeah, and then you have the obligation to provide dyslexia instruction, individualized dyslexia instruction under special education.
Right, okay. All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Leo Wilson.
Thank you, Commissioner. Charter schools currently are not part of that small school, middle-sized allotment, correct?
It's a complicated answer to that question. So a 700-student charter school does not get the small district allotment like a 700-student district does. But charter schools get a allotment which is all charter schools, regardless of size, get an allotment which is the average of the small and mid-sized allotment minus, I think, $125.
So they get some, but not all, or?
It's
Wait,
the school finance formulas provide an economy of scale adjustment, highly tailored to the size of the ISD. Charter schools don't get that at all. What charter schools get is a single average of the small and mid-sized, regardless of the size of the charter school. You could potentially call that a charter school allotment if you wanted to. It is the average of the small and mid-sized allotment.
But that creates a gap for them, right?
What that means is your smallest charter schools get less money than your smallest ISDs that are similarly sized, and then your larger charter schools get money that larger districts don't get in that portion of the M&O formulas.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on. You're going to have me back later today to talk about tri-agency work. Apologize in advance for the extra time. Everyone's looking forward to that. But I do want to provide at least a brief overview of the status of college and career military readiness in the state of Texas. So on slide 25, you have a visualization. There's a kind of this visual on the left-hand side and that blue box on the right-hand side. I'm going to talk about the blue box a second, the visualization first. This provides kind of a policy outline at a high level of the structure of career and technical education in the state of Texas. The agency 5 to 8 years ago went through a process with the Workforce Commission and really employers all over the state, identified all the major career clusters that exist in the vibrant Texas economy, identified specific programs of study that students could participate in to access a given career, identified which courses students would then need to take in those programs of study as a freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, identified which industry certifications that employers prioritize in that given industry that one would earn at the end of their high school experience or at the end of some career training experience, and then provided insight to districts as to what the job prospects were in those industries so that they could plan both which courses and careers to offer, and they could provide advice to this for their families as kids exercise choice within the school framework. So this is writ large a superstructure to have in your head about how career preparation works in Texas public schools. On the right-hand side speaks to the actions that the legislature has codified into law to create incentives to improve the robustness of college career military readiness generally, but of career and technical education in particular. So the A through F system, when it was adopted in 2017, required us to balance A through F. So it's not just grading a high school for the percentage of your kids going off to college or ready for college, but it's providing equal weight for readiness for career or college in the A through F system. You also have a funding mechanism called the CCMR Outcomes Bonus, College Career Military Readiness Outcomes Bonus. So this is success funding for students when they graduate that goes back to the districts. for getting them college, career, or military ready. You have adopted increases in your CTE funding over the years, including a tiered funding infrastructure so that higher level CTE courses generate more money than lower level CTE courses, again, to encourage districts to have kids on pathways through high school. There are P-TECH formula funds provided by the legislatures, I think $50 a student for any school that goes to a P-TECH model. This is a school that has a combination of a high school diploma, a college degree, and already work experience in a trade at the same time. It's a really remarkable experience for the students that have access to it. You also provide grant funds that helps launch both P-TECH and early college high school. Through the Workforce Commission, you have funded a JET grant program. This is for capital costs to retrofit or upgrade a CTE facility in both high schools and community colleges. And then last but not least, regional planning pathways grants, which are really designed to help campus principals and district leaders partner with institutes of higher education and major employers in an area to improve the strength of their career preparation offerings. This is just a high-level overview of a whole lot of law that y'all have done in CTE and in CCMR generally. Slide 26 gives you a breakdown of how well students are doing in terms of graduating from high school, college, career, or military ready. You saw early on in the presentation an overall percentage of CCMR rates for high school graduates. This gives you a breakdown of different types of CCMR. So the first bar is TSIA. We're Texas. We have our own version of the SAT. So that's the percentage of kids that are scoring at a college-ready level on the Texas version of the SAT, which you can see has declined precipitously since the onset of COVID. Those are different years. The most recent year is the graduating class of 2023. Then we also have the SAT and ACT, which has a similar trend coming out of COVID, a very significant decline in student readiness for college. We also look at AP and IB scores, and so that is held steady. We look at dual credit, which has seen a steady increase. And in fact, House Bill 8 passed by the legislature last session, I think will lead to even more increases in dual credit. There's something called a college prep course, which I can talk about at length. It's become very popular, but unfortunately the evidence is that students who complete that do not do well in college at all, so we're gonna have to improve that as a demonstration of readiness. And then you have an advanced diploma for students in special education, so we track whether students in special education have been awarded the advanced diploma, and you've seen some increase there for those students. And then a tripling of the number of high school graduates that earn an associate's degree at the time of graduation, but still a very small percent. Those are all what we would call, say, college readiness indicators. The next three or four are career readiness indicators. So big renaissance in industry-based certification. The state has done a really good job at expanding what old school we would call vocational education, new we would call career and technical education. A lot of improvements in districts offering that. The next one is for students that are special education that have a transition plan as part of special education. We track whether or not they have successfully transitioned to the workforce. We've seen some increases there. And then level 1, level 2 certificates are issued by things like TSTC and community colleges. The last graph is military readiness, which is mostly question marks because our data feed was unreliable until very recently. But you get a sense of the percentage of kids that have enlisted in the U.S. military coming out of our public high schools. Moving on.
Representative Hinojosa.
Thank you. I want to ask about the college readiness. There's an article I read in The Atlantic recently that college professors are saying kids don't know how to read books anymore.
Yeah, because they're not necessarily reading books in K-12. It's been a large problem.
The study that I saw, so it looks like they're reading books in their early grades, and then it's middle and high school that they're not necessarily reading books. That tracks with my own kids' experience, actually. One of the smartphones did come. It is one of the things to consider. One of the other things to consider is that we are so focused on short passage. Students reading short passages and answering those questions, for instance, on the STAR test, and less focus on reading
Full
books
novels.
of literature.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
I think it's a real problem. I also think that the legislature took a pretty big whack at this last session with House Bill 1605. This is essentially a problem of curriculum design in schools, and we as a country seem to have writ large coalesced around short passages for a variety of complex reasons, almost all of which don't serve students quite very well at all. And so ensuring that teachers have access to really high quality instructional materials, quality curriculum, that they are in fact reading novels is an important step. That bill set the stage for the State Board of Education to approve high quality instructional material design. So at the high school level, this would clearly involve full-blown novel studies, and in fact, many. And in English, you would expect like a senior in English literature to be reading probably 6 novels at a minimum, one every 6 weeks. So that legislation also compelled the State Board of Education to adopt essentially a novel list, a literary work list, as part of the TEKS. Because right now, if you read the TEKS don't tell you to read full-blown novels. So this is a underlying curriculum problem that needs to be addressed. I do think y'all took major steps on this last session, but it's going to take time because we descended to this short passage deal as a country over the course of about 20 years, and so we gotta get out of that habit.
But isn't that directly related to a focus on a STAR test, because that's what you have to do to perform well? There's no reading.
So the interesting thing, so STAR has short passages on it, and so many people thought it was wise then to design instruction that looked precisely the same as STAR. But assessing knowledge is not the same as teaching it, and in fact, districts that eschew that short passage approach and do longer novel studies have higher performance on STAR. So it's one of these things where people seem to be narrowing their curriculum delivery and instruction, potentially responding to the way a test looks, and as it turns out, it makes the kids do worse on that test. So this is a substantive curriculum problem.
One of the other things on this chart, you have how we perform on SAT, ACT. We have the option, do we not, to replace end of course exams with SAT, ACT?
That question is like somewhat of a complicated question to answer. Yes, depending upon which lanes and how. So you as a legislature compel students to pass a test to graduate. It's part of the EOC framework. That is a state law requirement, so if you wanted to change that state law requirement, you could, but underneath that state law requirement, we administratively authorize a substitute. So students who score at a certain criterion on the SAT or ACT count. So it's a substitute assessment.
It's a substitute, but what I mean, as the legislature, we could change the law. We're not under.
That's correct.
This federal requirements don't require that we do EOCs for
That is
seniors.
correct, and prior to EOCs, you had there's really kind of 2 ways you're gonna do this in high school. It's gonna be course specific, which is an EOC, or it's gonna be sequence based, which was the old, that was how you did it under TAX. And so you had like an 11th grade exit exam, and in math, that wasn't just pre-calculus. It was a little bit algebra 1, a little bit of geometry, a little bit of algebra 2, and it might have had a hint of pre-calculus. So the SAT is actually more like that. It's a sequence of math, sort of cumulative, where EOCs are just that course that year. So you can do either one under federal law. But one big caveat I would tell you is federal law requires you to have tests that test your state content standards. So the SAT is not aligned to the TEKS. And so you will run into that dilemma that if you're gonna have some different high school level exam under federal law, it's got to be an exam that is aligned to your state content standards.
So we could align our TEKS to SAT, ACT.
Yeah, you could compel the State Board of Education to rewrite the TEKS in some form or fashion if you wanted to.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on, complaints investigations. So one of the things that we do as the agency is we have a responsibility to investigate noncompliance with Texas Education Code. This is a broad responsibility. It involves individual educator misconduct allegations, but it also involves broader things than that. Slide 28 is just to give you some stats on the stuff that comes into the agency. So there are educator misconduct reports, of which in 2023 we had almost 4,000. There are criminal history references on employed educators. In 2023 we had 30,000. Contract abandonment disputes at 400. Academic integrity reports think, this is not a student who is doing something inappropriate. This is an adult doing something inappropriate, sort of encouraging cheating in some form or fashion. So there was 5,000 of those. General complaints, which is really everything else imaginable that's related to the education code or not, because people can complain to us about anything, is you can see 2,500, 2,600. Special education specific complaints, 1,100. Data reviews, this is where we do an analysis and we'll get a submission of data, and it seems illogical that that data can be accurate. So there are 900 of those. 65 appeals to the local grievance process, 424 special education due process hearings. So when you think about one of the agency's responsibilities to ensure that the education code is being complied with, this just gives you a sense of volume coming in to our oversight, investigations, complaints, governance teams. To give you a little bit more specifics as to how this works, and just because a complaint comes in doesn't mean there's validity to the complaint, but there often is. So, so this is the general education complaint volume specifically. So slide 29. So that is that one, like that fourth row, general education complaints, 2,600. You can see 2,600 in 2023, and this gives you a sense of how we categorize the dominant nature of the complaint. So it could be an educator matter. This was a complaint about a certified or uncertified educator. There's if they're certified, you can see that's the dark blue starting. We tracked it separately starting in 2022. We will sometimes get complaints about non-certified educators. That's the light blue, but we have almost no authority to do anything with them, so we largely have to close them immediately. You have special investigations. These are things that typically involve something very unusual and somewhat systemic in a district, and it can be anything: fraud, waste, and abuse, any number of things. There's compliance reviews. Alternative dispute resolution is a rapid response problem. This is, think about a parent that says they won't enroll my student. This is not something you got to spend a whole lot of time. You can go through a very slow process on. You have to call people immediately if they're not enrolling a kid. So those are general education complaints, just a sense of the volume over the last 5 years. Slide 30 gives you a volume count from the last 3 years of educator misconduct allegations of some form or fashion. So the big green chart, sorry that the number seems to be cut off on my printout, but that is criminal arrest records. So if an educator gets arrested, if an educator gets indicted, educator gets convicted, that information all comes to our team. If they are a certified educator, we do something about that in coordination with SBEC. If they are an uncertified educator, we can only do something about that if it involves 3 specific statutory violations. Otherwise, we have to discard that. So I'm happy to talk at length about that. But then the blue chart is not criminal history hits. That is actually reports that come to us specifically. And so we get referrals from CPS as they have completed investigations. We get referrals from something called the NASTech, which is an interstate consortium of tracking certified educators all over the country. And so if you got sanctioned and revoked in Arkansas, we find out about it and ensure that you're not teaching in Texas. There are superintendent reports, so they're obligated to report to us misconduct. There's some serious test security issues, and then the general complaints that get routed for misconduct evaluation. The next slide, on slide 31, tells you what has happened to all of those for, say, just the year of 2023. So the dark blue section is, we have placed a flag on the educator's file that they are under investigation, and our team is working often with law enforcement to do a thorough investigation to determine whether or not that person should be prevented from employment in public schools. This is independent of any criminal ramifications that may happen. The orange review is the preliminary investigation, And so if you have a complaint comes in and says, hey, the teacher hit a child, CPS has investigated it. CPS said, actually, the teacher leaned over, was holding a laptop, it fell, laptop hit the child. There was no formal misconduct. So we do an investigation of every educator misconduct allegation, but if they don't rise to the level of warranting prohibiting them from employment in public education, they go through the preliminary review process and then stop, which is what you would expect.
Chairman Dutton has a question.
I just had a question when you mentioned a teacher hit a child. Are teachers prohibited from self-defense?
No.
So the self-defense statute would apply to any teacher conduct as well?
Teachers have, there's general self-defense statutes and there's some specific self-defense statutes related to teachers.
Right, so if a child hit a teacher and the teacher hit the child back, that wouldn't result in a teacher?
We would have to evaluate each one of these on a case-by-case basis. The facts of these cases are very specific.
Right. But generally, the teacher would be, self-defense would be available to the teacher.
Teachers
There's
are
nothing in the
always,
statutes that-
can always lawfully defend their person.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Representative Leo Wilson.
On the one where you got a lot of complaints on page 29, it said that the majority of complaints are on operational concerns. Is that operational concerns at like their district level and not with TA?
This is,
Like-
I disagree with something that happened in the district, but it is not an education code violation.
Okay. Is there, I don't know if this, is there a way to better educate maybe campuses if it's an operational complaint? So that we're not spending state tax dollars in your agency just having a massive amount of operational complaints?
Yeah, it's a great question. Part of this, I think, has to do with the grievance processes that districts have locally and how clear those are to families, and how they can be used to equip families with clarity to solve disputes between families and their schools. I do think that statute is worthy of attention because it's right now the statute basically says have a grievance process and nothing else. And so we think that there are ways for us to communicate to districts more clearly about complaints that we've gotten, ways for them to communicate more clearly with their parents. But that's probably worthy of its own deep dive.
Well, and I would like you to look at this, but I have a bill that is a parents' rights handbook, because when I started looking at it, it's all over the place. Like, some of them are federal, some of them are in our state statutes, some of them are here. And so it would create like
One place to go.
one place to go for parents to know what their rights are and possibly add to it maybe what the grievance process looks like. I'm just kind of concerned that the majority of those are coming to you.
Well, and we think it would be a very nice feature for parents generally if they're on the TEA website, we could tell them and potentially help them just directly communicate a complaint to their district as opposed to filing it with us. Right now, we can't easily do that. We would need some integration between us and districts that doesn't exist. Y'all could pass a law to set up that integration up, but that would be, we think, a very useful value add. We could also then help provide sort of common language for parents across the state on like, this is generally how things work, so that you know how you can maximize the system to the advantage of your child.
Okay, I would like to make sure I have included all of that in that parent.
What bill number did you want me to look at?
I don't even know the bill
If
number
just
right
reach
now.
out to us, we'll
Okay,
follow up.
thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
All right, Representative Bryant.
Mr. Morath, on slide 29, at the top right-hand corner, you said you list among these things that you have to investigate general education complaints. What is that?
It's the best way to think about that is a complaint that doesn't otherwise meet one of the other categories on the page before. So a general complaint is just a complaint that comes in. So you might, for example, as a parent, have a specific special education due process complaint. we don't think of that as a complaint, that we track it differently. So the stats on the page before give you a sense of, this is generally how we internally categorize all the stuff that comes in.
Would a complaint about the curriculum
That could be
go in there?
that could be a, like, this is, if it's not one of these other things, it is a general education complaint, and it can be anything you could possibly think of in the entirety of the education code and things that have nothing to do with the education code.
Do you receive very many complaints about the curriculum?
We have received complaints about curriculum, we've received complaints about library books, we've received complaints. If you've read about it in the news, I guarantee we've received complaints on it.
Do you find any valid complaints about the school district teaching something they shouldn't be teaching?
That is a very broad question. I will say, for example, 3Qing, which is now legally prohibited from being taught and being instructional materials. We have reason to believe that is still in some instructional
What was
materials.
that again? I didn't hear.
3Qing, it's I don't think that's what you meant with your question, because I think you're probably thinking about things that we might think are inappropriate. I'm trying to think of like a categorical example. What I will say is that it is a very big state, and while we have in most classrooms, in fact, the overwhelming majority of classrooms every day in most districts and every day, people are using very good judgment and doing what they can. It is a very big state, and there are anomalies, and that's a lot of the times that's what we hear in our complaints department.
So you don't see any need for any kind of systemic change to deal with some districts that are teaching things they shouldn't be teaching?
I don't know that I would go so far as that. I mean, to some extent, y'all did some of this last session in House Bill 1605. There was also, I think, there was a independent of instructional materials in classrooms. There was a library bill last session, House Bill 900, which has been partially enjoined in the courts. I mean, I think it's almost always worthy for us to look at the quality of curricular resources that are in classroom and ensure that we provide as much transparency and quality support as possible. We're still in the early stages of implementing a pretty massive set of reforms y'all passed last session with House Bill 1605. I don't know that I would have specific counsel for you on follow-ups to that legislation at this point. I think if I spent some more time, I probably might have some recommendations for you.
And I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but you so far haven't seen any need for a systemic change to remedy the problem of districts teaching things they shouldn't be teaching.
There are, I would say, there are periodic examples that come in that don't pass my reasonable person smell test, but also aren't a violation of an education code provision. And I think that those areas are potentially worthy of additional policymaking attention.
And give me an example of one of those areas.
I think this comes up a lot with in sex education in particular, and things that are not part of sex education instruction but seem to show up in other classes that seem sex education adjacent. I'm not just Commissioner of Education, I'm a dad. I got, my oldest is 11-year-olds, I have an 8-year-old, and I have 2 6-year-olds, and there are things that I want them to learn later, and then things that I think are appropriate for them to learn now, and sometimes I don't universally agree with sort of curriculum decisions that I see being made in terms of what content is being exposed at what level locally.
And have you made that clear to the committee or to?
I do. As I've talked to members, we try to surface with members that reach out to us on specific topics. You know, there's 150 of y'all. You have different areas of focus, but we do talk to members of the committee on a fairly regular basis. Try to surface what we see as challenges and things that might be worthy of additional policymaking attention.
So out of the 1,200 school districts, how many of them are crossing the line there in that area?
I mean, I'd have to do a bunch of statistical work on our grievances to sort of figure out that, and I don't think I have an answer to that. But I can try to find out if you're interested in the number of complaints that have been filed in the last few years related to library books or the complaints related to curriculum. I can certainly track that number down and share it with you.
Well, what I'm looking for is some evidence, or absence of evidence, that we need to make a significant systemic change in the way in which we educate children as a result of that. It sounds like the answer to that is no. Would you agree?
I mean, I think the answer to that is as we do special investigations are called special for a reason. They are unusual. But we do sometimes uncover areas of law that are completely unclear that have led to whatever the circumstance is in that particular situation. So to the extent that we identify that during our normal regulatory duties, we do attempt to share that with all interested members of this committee.
Now, it would be reasonable to say, would it not, that if you saw the need for a significant systemic change in our school system, that you would tell us, right?
Absolutely, and in fact, last session, one of the major areas of focus for this committee, and ultimately was a piece of statute passed by the legislature, was related to the quality of instructional materials, period. And I think that bill, school districts and the agency is in process of implementing now, and we have reason to believe it's having a very positive effect on curricular quality, both overall quality, and if there's any sort of inappropriateness, it also helps attack those issues as well. So there already has been a systemic adjustment started.
Have you called for any change like that in this presentation?
No, sir, not. I don't think so.
Thank you.
Let me make sure the record reflects that Chairman Dutton has joined us. It's been a little bit ago, and I forgot to announce that. So I want to make sure that's on the record. We're glad you're here. Better late than never. Chairman Leach.
Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner, did I hear you say, did I understand correctly, that the TEA's enforcement and investigatory authority is different with respect to certified versus non-certified
Yes,
teachers?
it's very different, and yes.
So again, correct me if I'm wrong, the vast majority of teachers now who are entering the profession in Texas are uncertified.
That's correct.
To my count, it's nearly, by the math you gave us earlier, nearly 20,000 new educators per year that are uncertified.
That's right. In fact,
And-
do you have that stat on the percentage of the total workforce that's uncertified? Yeah, and because it has been a growing source of new teachers, the overall percentage of employed teachers that is uncertified is now at 11% statewide, sort of writ large, so out of 380,000.
So
And it's
help
been
me
growing pretty
understand
rapidly.
the policy reasoning for why that's the case. Why does TEA not have the statutory? Why is the standard not the same? Why is the TEA's authority when it comes to investigating and enforcing state law different with respect to certified and uncertified teachers?
So it's a great question. Let me start with saying it's not actually even TEA's authority. This is the State Board of Educator Certification. I'm their administrative arm. So the State Board for Educator Certification, those are gubernatorial appointees. They set policy and exercise oversight on the definition and the professional conduct of certified educators. Certified educators is teachers, but it's also principals. It's anybody that's subject to a certification. In 2015, a law was passed to allow districts to hire uncertified teachers. Prior to that, charters were authorized also to hire uncertified teachers. The SBEC has sort of broad investigatory and sanctioning authority that's not explicitly spelled out. It's sort of broad authority. And so under that policymaking board, they essentially have authority to go after any number of cases. And sort of as they have evaluated individual misconduct cases over the years, they sort of adjust. And so their purview sort of matches that. But uncertified educators, there is no SBEC for uncertified educators. So about 4 sessions ago, the state of Texas created a do not hire registry that applies to all public school employees, certified and uncertified alike. Prior to that, that didn't even exist. But in order to end up on the do not hire registry, you have to have done one of only 3 things. And if it's not one of those 3 things, that means that you don't end up on the do not hire registry, which means there is no investigatory oversight from the agency. Now, you may be fired for that, but there's no permanent record of you, and you could then get hired by another district without their knowledge that that's why you were fired.
What are those 3 things?
One of is an inappropriate student-teacher. You abused or unlawfully or otherwise committed an unlawful act with a student or minor, or you were involved in a romantic relationship with or solicited or engaged in sexual contact with a student or minor. And actually, even the solicitation is specifically the solicitation statute, which means sort of boundary violations don't count. So we cannot put somebody on the do not hire registry who is an uncertified educator solely for boundary violations, which is really what you think of as sort of pre-grooming behavior.
And is that just by virtue of state law not allowing?
That's state law, that's right. And we are compelled, we will get criminal history hits on all these individuals, but if it is not one of those things that ends you up on the do not hire registry, we immediately discard it. So this could also involve drug use at a campus. That doesn't put you on a do not hire registry if you're an uncertified employee. If you're a certified employee, your license is going to be revoked for that. So there are substantive differences in this policy framework.
So we'll have more conversations so I can understand this more fully, but it seems like to me, when we're talking about conduct, the standard should be the same for any employee that's on a campus, certified or uncertified, when it comes to state law and granting you enforcement and investigatory authority in the interest of protecting our children, that whether it's certified or uncertified, the standard when it comes
Certainly
to
anyone who
conduct should be the same.
interacts with a student. And that can be a lot of people. Bus drivers interact with students. And bus drivers are not certified employees.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Allen?
Yes. Commissioner, is there a mandatory training for employees, it's everybody, teachers included, ethics training?
Yes.
So they don't get involved in complaints?
Yes.
Mandatory?
Yes.
Every year?
I don't know about every year. I'd have to check that.
Okay.
I can find out.
Because the turnover is great.
When you said every year, I interpreted the question differently. All new employees have to get
Okay,
this.
all right, okay. Are you finding that the new uncertified teachers, which you say are in a majority right now, are teachers that are getting the complaints now?
I don't think I have statistics on that. We could potentially analyze that. I do not believe we have analyzed that.
Yeah, because if you don't know the rules, if you don't know the law, you're
It's
subject
certainly a
to-
plausible hypothesis.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. There was one part of this bar that I didn't describe, so that I just, before we leave it, I think, Chairman Leach, your questions are relevant to this, but on slide 31, it just shows what is the sort of, at least immediate investigatory disposition of the inbound educator misconduct reports or criminal history hits. And so 2,381 had a formal investigation, reached the formal investigation stage. 10,000 reached, had a preliminary investigation done, but was not elevated to a formal investigation, largely think of exoneration having happened. And then 21,000 are where we get a criminal misconduct report, but it is an uncertified employee and we have no authority to do anything with it. So it is simply discarded. That was all for 2023 by itself. Okay, so next, reporting school performance. So on slide 30, numbers cut off, 30-something, the concept of the existence of the A through F system is predicated on research. The state law says it exists to improve outcomes for students, to make Texas one of the highest achieving states in the state, and close socioeconomic gaps by race and by class among our students. There is evidence that we have from the last 20 years that having a public accountability system is good for children. There's a great study that you can follow that link if you're interested in reading that study. But we do know that the existence of a public rating system that is a tiered performance rating system results in students doing better academically, doing better socially, doing better subsequently in life in terms of income. So having accountability is good for kids. And in terms of public accountability ratings, we have not had accountability for the last 2 years.
Vice Chair Bernal has a
Yes, sir.
question.
Just quickly on this slide, because I did go to the.
Yep.
This is not a TEA study. This is a
Yeah, it's some
a
independent
journal
group.
from.
That's right.
Somewhere else. The question I have is whether we're talking about accountability in general, and whether or not an accountability system in general results in the kind of outcomes we're talking about here, or if we're talking about our accountability system, number one, and number two is, and by the way, this is not an argument against accountability, just so that's clear. One of the words they use here is pressure, right? Our analysis reveals that pressure on schools to avoid a low performance rating led low scoring students to score significantly. Sure, if a student's not doing well, then we would assume that their teacher and everyone else would pour into them and help them do better. Maybe the argument is that without an accountability system that wouldn't happen. I don't believe that, but that's what they're inferring here. But my question is, not accountability systems, but the way that we do it here, is this true for us, number one? And number two, is there a study on whether or not using language that
A through F labels.
that third graders and middle schoolers understand about their own failures, what effect that has?
Yeah.
And how that relates to the pressure? Because this is about 10th graders, right? That's what this is about. That the 10th graders do better.
No, they analyzed it longitudinally through
Right,
10th
which is where-
grade.
which is
So
where they get the 25
I believe
years.
they started this with third graders.
Yes. It's about the 10th grade performance, and then they go further out and measure what they make.
Income at 25-year-olds, yeah.
My question is, and again, accountability is fine, but have they measured what it means to an 8-year-old?
Yeah.
Or a bunch of 8-year-olds to find themselves at a school that's labeled F as opposed to unacceptable
Yep.
or needs improvement?
So two answers to your question. So this was a study of the Texas accountability system when it had the four labels: unacceptable, acceptable, recognized, and exemplary. So this was very specific to the Texas context, but it's like 20 plus years ago.
Right.
It was also a longitudinal study, so it tracked how well the students did from third grade all the way through their 25th year of life. The conclusion was the public issuance of accountability ratings caused the most at-risk kids to accelerate the most, which is not quite the same thing as what you said, which is having accountability causes people to fix these issues. Not having accountability does not cause these people. It's a question of degree, intensity, speed, effort, that sort of thing. So
Sure.
that's what this study was.
And do we know if the study, since we've transitioned
To A through F.
to A through F, if that trend continues?
I don't know that a similar. This was a 20-year longitudinal study, so it takes a while to do a study like this. To my knowledge, an independent group has not done that, but they may be in process, and I just might be not knowledgeable. However, there was a study out of Florida related to the A through F ratings in particular, and that study showed that the labels, the F label was more effective than the unacceptable label at rapidly increasing student performance.
Understood. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. While that is this policy of the state of Texas, for the last 2 years I have been enjoined from issuing ratings. And so what we have here is just a broad a sort of underlying scale score distribution, not allocated by campus or by district. It shows you what the distribution of campuses were on the underlying scale score methodology of the performance rating system, the accountability system in Texas in 23, how it changed or did not change in 2024. We are currently enjoined on 2 different lawsuits for 2 different years by a Travis County District Court. The appellate court has heard one of those, but not the other one. We're in some sort of appellate court land on those 2 cases. So we normally have all of this information really easy available for parents to find on texasschools.gov, but texasschools.gov does not have that information, has not had updated information since 2022. Last topic is school safety. The legislature passed different House Bill 3 last session, significantly added resources to TEA, 30 or 40 team members that are school safety personnel. This gives you a picture of the sort of org chart of the TEA staff. These are largely field staff, so staff in Corpus and in Lufkin and in Panhandle and et cetera. And they conduct a variety of oversight and support operations with schools to ensure that schools are executing against the best practices related to safety that we're aware of and that have been codified in state law and recommended by the School Safety Center. We have some reason to believe that the state's physical safety posture has been improving. One of the ways that we do this is there's an audit framework where it's referred to as an intruder detection audit. So an individual, this is just for clarity, this is a suit and tie. This is not somebody walking up to a school that looks frightening, and they just attempt to open a door to like the lunchroom. And what you want is school districts need to have control over their physical plant. They need to allow parents and other authorized individuals into the school, and they need to only allow people who are authorized to come into the school. So we've seen some year-over-year improvement in the success of intruder detection audits. There is no such thing as perfect safety. This is always a continuous improvement effort, but the investments that the legislature have made have resulted in a very strong tiered safety posture that we continue to implement. That is my overview of the public education landscape. Mr. Chairman and committee members, I'm happy to answer any additional questions if they haven't already been asked.
Yeah. Representative Hinojosa. Then we'll go here.
Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner, I feel a lot of pressure about this meeting because I feel like this is the only opportunity we're going to get to ask you questions this session. Last session, you only came to the first meeting, and which I believe is a departure from prior sessions. And you did show up to the Senate hearings, but not to the House public education hearings. And so I haven't even wanted to go to the bathroom because I didn't want you to leave because I feel like this is my only opportunity. And I don't know if we're less important than the Senate Education Committee, but it's good to have you here, and I would ask that you please try to make it a priority to attend, especially with these big changes to policy that we're evaluating and considering this session, because you are our #1 education professional who we look to for guidance.
Yes, ma'am. Well, I'm sorry that I didn't intentionally avoid. I will come to any meeting that you invite me to, as always. I think you have my cell number. You can call me anytime, day or night.
Well, I appreciate it. I think it's important that we have these conversations in public as well, because it's in the public interest to know the information that I know. This weekend, I went to a teacher listening session that all the legislators were invited to attend, and I had the opportunity, it's not the first time I've done it, but the first time this year I've done it, had the opportunity to sit in small circles with teachers and hear their experience. And there was a question asked of the teachers: if your school was fully funded, how would you spend that money? What do you think their #1 answer was?
I'm interested in hearing what you have to say.
More professional educators on a campus. I heard story after story of class sizes being too big. I've told the story of my own son not getting a 5th grade teacher in Austin ISD when he was at Becker Elementary. But the struggles of not just larger classes, but kids with more issues, more challenges in the class, was the repeated theme that I heard from our teachers. I've asked the agency for information on class size waivers. I'm not sure that your agency was transparent to say these might not be all of them, because for our districts of innovation,
They might not even have to file them. Yeah.
They might not have to submit, or they may not be submitting their waivers. And I know you provided a chart that shows we have more teachers than ever before, we have more students than ever before. How do we identify what is the problem there? Why are these teachers experiencing this?
So, one, if it is, even though we don't get class size waivers, we do have data related to class sizes because that comes into the PEIMS data submission. So we can provide you on a campus-by-campus basis the total instructional staff to student ratio. We can also provide you an indication by teacher of record how many students they have and what the distribution is. That would be a pretty large data set for the state as a whole, but if we collaborate, I can figure out exactly how to share that information in a way that's clear for you, and happy to do that. We've done that kind of analysis historically, for example, and it shows that in our smallest and most rural schools, they have much lower student-to-teacher ratios, largely because they are sort of compelled to, because they have much lower overall student counts. And that has also then caused a salary reduction in our smaller rural schools relative to our larger. So I think there is insight for policymakers to be gleaned from examining those data sets. The lived experience of an individual teacher in Texas, I've done well over 700 school visits. The lived experience of individual teachers in the state is highly varied because the deployment decisions and the master schedule decisions, the PD calendar decisions, the instructional calendar decisions, the staffing pattern decisions that are made from one campus to the next, from one district to the next, are highly varied. But I think virtually every human that I talk to is always in favor of smaller class sizes. Parents are, teachers are. How a class size gets structured is actually even more complex than just the money that you provide to the school district. So if you consider a high school environment where you're gonna have a master schedule, typical high school might have 7-period day. What if you have an advanced calculus class and then also then a pre-calculus class, and you have some seniors in one and some seniors in the other? You will be able to walk into high school classes in this state and you will see like 5 children in some of those high school classes in the same school building, where you will walk into another classroom and it has 35 children in. So you see a very different level of lived experience in terms of the actual class size based upon a bunch of master schedule decisions that are made writ large. One of the recommendations that we received from the teacher vacancy task force was technical assistance supports to school districts to analyze alternative master schedule approaches. You know, what is somewhat unique about being in the chair that I am is I can see across systems and see, you know, this school, even this one subset over here, they seem to be doing a lot better than this approach. But these people don't even know that this is a possibility. And so how do you share that and spread that so that they can know? There are so many factors that degrade the quality of life of our teachers or improve it, or that make them less sort of capable of being successful, or more capable of being successful. And one of those, again, we talked about extensively last session. If a teacher has to spend 6.5 hours a day delivering instruction, so if their master schedule is set up so that they are in front of kids and performing 6 hours a day, 6.5 hours a day, I don't know what your expectation is for a normal workday, but for most people, it's an 8-hour workday. That's generally what we think of, like we generally want an 8-hour workday. Well, if I have to spend 6 hours delivering instruction, then I have a total of 2 hours to think about instruction. And that is not enough. And so, anyways, this is on top of ARD committee meetings, specific interventions, small group instruction adjustments that have to be made. And so the funding resources that are provided to schools are definitely part of this equation, but it's not the only part of the equation, because one could take the money and spend it X way or Y way and not resolve some of those tensions that teachers feel in their lived experience.
Right. It's not just money that is helpful to improve outcomes. It is how you spend the money.
Sure.
But you do need a base amount of investment so that you can achieve standards.
So there are a couple of national studies on this that I think are illustrative. One that was reproduced looking at all the one-time COVID money, and some of these go back couple of decades. And the best conclusion that I draw from these national studies is that no strings attached money when invested in public education, for every $1,000 of a per pupil budget increase that a district receives, a school system receives, you should expect roughly 4 additional days of learning. Conversely, if there's a $1,000 reduction due to inflation or other reasons, you should expect, on average, a 4-day reduction in learning. That's the ROI model from the best literature that we have around the country on additional investments, which isn't to say that money doesn't matter. $1,000 a kid gets you 4 days. But put in perspective, at about 4.5 months of learning decline as a result of COVID. So at that ROI, you would have to use every element of the Texas GDP solely for education to just catch up with sort of COVID loss. So I think the way that I always try to think about this, especially as I'm looking at literature and whatnot, is what's the highest ROI possible? Where do we get this sort of, can you invest $400 per kid and get 40 days instead of $1,000 per kid and get 4?
Right, but if you invested it in paying teachers better so you could keep teachers, have more certified teachers, that would probably be a wise investment. That would be a wise investment of our dollars, wouldn't it?
Yeah, so what we saw in the Dallas experience, I think, is illustrative. So Dallas ended up paying more per teacher than, like the Dallas average salaries are higher than almost everybody in the region. But they also changed the way salaries work. So that there's this sort of staggered, and so a Stanford economist studied this, and from the time period from 2015 to 2019, Dallas closed the racial achievement gap by about 25 percentage points as a result of the selection change in what happened with teacher retention or turnover. And Dallas's turnover prior to this was materially higher than the state's on average, and now Dallas's overall turnover is lower. So that's not just an average wage increase. It was an average wage increase,
right.
But it was also a completely different structure of compensation increases that led to very substantive improvements in teacher retention and very substantive improvements in student learning.
Great. So, and I'm sorry, I have a few questions here. So, to be clear, what I heard from teachers on campuses in the district I represent is not just more teachers, and certified teachers was specifically mentioned, right? Because then the certified teachers have to fill in the gaps.
For the uncertified.
For the uncertified
Especially
teachers.
if they quit in the middle of the year.
Right. But also just caring professionals on the campus.
Yep.
I've also told a story about my son tried to run away in the 2nd grade because he was sick of practice tests for the STAR that he was having to do in anticipation of 3rd grade STAR, but the vice principal intercepted him at the exit. He had said he was going to the bathroom, but he ran for the exit, and she was there. She got cut with budget cuts the following year. We didn't have her on our campus. I do think that having enough caring individuals on a campus is probably the #1 safety thing we can do for our kids. When our campuses are understaffed, that's just harder for classroom management, school, I mean, all of it, behavior management, and just eyes on what's happening on a campus. I would ask that you consider that when you're looking at school safety for our school districts. But I want to get back to the certified teachers issue and how, just let me express how unacceptable it is that we have such a high percentage of certified teachers. I do think that we need to take responsibility for some of that because we've made it easier to get into a classroom without certification. We have now these districts of innovation that allow for that, and especially when you don't have to pay the $4,000, why would you, right? So that is a policy decision that we have made as a legislature. But when you see the stark differences in achievement and attendance, I think we should think about how we can improve our certification. One of the things I notice is it's not just that the school districts aren't hiring certified teachers, but we're not producing the same number of certified teachers, and we have had a significant cut in education preparation programs over the last several years or so.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
Well, you haven't really cut any funding for educator preparation programs because you never funded them in the first place. They are just naturally going away because fewer candidates are choosing to use their own hard-earned money to cover those costs.
But you have oversight over SBEC and requirements for the education preparation programs, don't you?
SBEC has oversight over educator preparation programs. I'm SBEC's secretary and staff. So technically SBEC has oversight of them, not me.
Has oversight over nothing?
SBEC has oversight over educator preparation programs. I execute their oversight. So to the extent that I have oversight, it's because I'm acting in their agent. Sorry, it's
Okay.
a technical detail.
So under section 21.004 of the Education Code, it says the agency, SBEC, and THECB shall develop and implement programs to recruit students and professionals into the teaching profession. It sounds like you have a responsibility there.
That's right. Y'all have provided some funding for what we have invested in as a Grow Your Own initiative for roughly the last 6 to 8 years. That is extremely popular, and the evidence among districts and the evidence base that we have is that it's highly effective in terms of recruiting and bringing people into the profession.
My challenge is that when I was on the school board, we had a superintendent where if we'd see a drop in certification, we'd say, okay, how are you gonna fix this, right? There was accountability. And how do we hold you accountable, or who are we supposed to be holding accountable for a drop so significantly in certification of teachers when to your point, it is the most important thing we can do in our child's education?
I would love for you to hold me accountable for that, but I don't really hire teachers. Districts do. I oversee educator preparation programs on behalf of the State Board of Educator Certification, but I can't force people into those programs. I use the resources that y'all have given us to invest in Grow Your Own programs. I would certainly favor an expansion or an evaluation of the policy framework so that we actually have, so I have some tools to impact this. The Texas Education Agency, we provide leadership guidance and support. That is not the same thing as running schools. And so there are places where we do intervene and run schools, and everywhere that happens, you see student outcomes go up. And then there's the sort of broad oversight lanes that you have told me to follow, and so under your legislative framework. But I think this is an us accountability, so partially me, partially the legislature. This demands legislative policy action, and then I need to execute accordingly.
And because we look to you for expertise on this issue, if the Grow Your Own plan apparently is not enough to get us there, maybe it's not big enough, whatever it may be, I think we need a plan for how we get there that I don't know currently exists. Finally, I want to
There's a plan.
There's a plan? Okay, great.
Look forward to bringing it to this committee.
Great. I want to talk about NAEP scores. And so I appreciate you providing that chart of NAEP scores
Yes, ma'am.
peaking in about 2015, because I noticed that's about when our scores-ish peaked. But it
that's
also
countrywide, and Texas has a similar trend. Yes, ma'am.
Texas has a similar trend. It also happens to be when you started here that afterwards our scores have gone down, but I appreciate you showing me that it was not just Texas, it's a national trend. Another thing I've noticed, though, is the other year after which our scores went down, and I talk about NAEP because STAR, we keep changing, so we can't really evaluate year to year how our kids are progressing or how we're doing. We can't evaluate ourselves just based on STAR scores. NAEP, though, is the only thing we have to compare state to state and to track our performance that I know of. And 2011 is the other high point for NAEP scores for Texas.
So we have a detailed analysis on when NAEP peaked at various years. Because in some cases it peaked at 2011 and in others it peaked in 2015. This has been a subject of inquiry internally because we want to see NAEP scores in Texas be #1 in both absolute and relative terms, period. And so the question is how do we collaboratively, me as your chief executive and y'all as the policymaking body, what changes can we make to do this? So for example, there were trend analysis that we saw related to reading proficiency in particular that led us to conclude in part this was due to a need in pre-K, in part to conclude a need for strong investment in reading academies, so instruction for teachers on evidence-based literacy practices, and in part related to curriculum that is aligned with that. So some of those changes have happened from a state policy perspective. Some of those changes are still in process. The way that we're set up is we provide the framework for that, school districts execute against it. We had some reason to believe coming out of COVID that our elementary reading investments were beginning to work. And then of course, in the most recent 2 years, we don't see evidence of that. So we've been reflecting on it to see what has happened. There's been a lot of things that have changed in the last 2 years. You haven't had any A through F accountability in the last 2 years. You have a big growth in uncertified teachers in the last years. Had a big growth in 4-day school weeks in the last 2 years, and we have reason to believe that's causing a downward trend in student achievement too. So there are some of these sort of broader factors that we think are worthy of state policy making. I would say one broad observation though is like so much of this is leadership. The state policy framework, it is not me who is running public education for the state of Texas. You have 1,200 locally governed school systems. We intervene in cases of pretty significant challenges, and so there's, 8 or so school systems where there's an ongoing intervention, but otherwise, it's your local school systems, and so you have to reflect as well on how well do we support school board members, how well do we support superintendents and their leadership teams and invest in them and their leadership of their local school district.
I know a lot of school board members who would beg to differ. They feel that we micromanage a lot of what they're able to do. For instance, you get money for teachers, but you get it for the teacher incentive allotment. You get money for safety, but you got to use it this way. Kind of on and on. We have typically strings attached, and that's why I'm looking to how we hold ourselves accountable or you accountable for outcomes when there's so much that we control within our districts. But I want to point out one very bright spot that you spoke to the Appropriations Committee about. The only place where I can see we've had drastic increases in performance in NAEP, and that's for our English language learners.
Yeah, Texas is probably the best state in the union for teaching kids who come from households that don't speak English.
And we've also improved significantly.
Yeah, not only are we the best state, but we keep getting better.
Right. Why do you think that is?
So again, it's hard to identify causal factors because it's not like I have a random controlled trial that's the state did this and the state did this. And then, but that being said, there are a few things that I think are somewhat unique to Texas. One, we have a specific allocation in the school finance system for bilingual students. And in fact, it's 50% higher for dual language instruction as a result of changes made during House Bill 3 in 2019. So you have that's one thing. Another thing is we have specific teacher certification requirements related to bilingual education, so to make sure that not only do you know how to teach simultaneously in both languages. That's, I think, part of the factor. And I think the third, I'm trying to remember what I said to the other committee. You need to tell me if I'm missing something. But the third big factor is we have a lot of non-English speaking students. And as a result, we likely have more managerial expertise because when you do things more frequently, it improves your efficacy. And so we probably just have a better experience-based, more experience-based teaching students that come from households that don't speak English. We have our state has far more bilingual educators than any other state in the country. I mean, it's not even close. So those are probably the three big factors.
Okay, so investment, certification, and experience.
That's right.
You have a chart in here, I think it's page 6, where you look through the per student, or slide 6, per student funding, and it's 15 and some change.
No, slide 6, I'm sorry.
Slide 6.
Yes, ma'am.
That state investment includes property tax reduction, doesn't it?
are you talking about this slide?
Yep.
Okay. So this is money going into public schools, except maybe if you would argue about $100, that's probably TEA and service centers. But this is money going into public schools. So some of that is funded from local property taxes. If you think about a district like district that you're very familiar with, Austin, pays a huge chunk of money in recapture. That district doesn't experience that funding, but that funding then comes to the state, gets appropriated, and that's the reason why you see it in that little hash mark. So this is the average amount of funding in a district's budget for public education.
But the statewide funding number, that includes our the property tax relief that we gave last session. That was buying down the districts.
So as property taxes are compressed, what you will see is this gray bar gets smaller and the blue bar gets bigger. You can compress property taxes and not change a district's budget a nickel.
Right.
That's a tax policy issue.
Okay.
And so this actually predates your most recent tax compression. We'll be able to give you that data before the end of session, but probably not before April. And so we'll be able to give you the same bar for the 23-24 school year. And what you will see that school year is the blue will be materially higher and the gray will be lower, and the overall amount will still be up a little bit.
Okay, and you said that includes about $100 TEA oversight. I thought you had said 200 to.
Well, I mean, like
to
I got to do this
appropriations.
math. I need to get a calculator out. It's our direct budget is roughly 200 million. So that includes like administration of the STAR test and agency employees, a bunch of other things. So if I take 200 million divided by 5.5 million, 200. That is $36. Sorry.
Oh, it's $36 this year?
36, so 36 of that 15,503. Assuming I didn't mess up a zero on my calculator, somebody should check the math on that. It's not good doing live math. Yeah, that's my quick calculation.
Okay. What about the federal funds? Do those the federal funding that's reflected on that chart, is that any of that funding, did that go to TEA?
That would be inside that $36.
The federal funding, it's all of it's 30, that's hard to believe when it's just like minimally the FTE growth is up 33% and the foundation school program is only up 23% in the last 10-ish years.
I mean,
Your
you're
TEA
welcome to check
FTE
my
growth.
math, but
Okay.
our $200 million budget divided by 5.5 million, unless I screwed that calculation up, is $36.
Okay. And then also, so my former staffer did her master's degree on looking at your contracts and saw that TEA vendor contracts have doubled from 2017 to 23, I think, from 71 to 148. So it seems like there's been a lot of growth at the agency.
Well, one thing is a vendor contract with the agency may or may not have anything to do with money coming to the agency. So if we do a contract for everybody to get free access to some tutoring program, we're administering that on behalf of the state. So our money that flows through to school districts flows through to school
Right.
districts.
We decide how it gets spent.
That's right.
Okay, and so remarkably, do you know when the last time TEA has gone through sunset and there's been a sunset bill to change?
It hasn't been since I've been here, so that's been at least 8 years, nine years.
We can't find one since 1995, which I find remarkable. Thank you.
Representative Tallarico. Okay, Chairman Hunter?
Commissioner, you don't have to answer all this today, but I want to make sure you know what I'm concerned about. You and I talked after the Hurricane Harvey. It doesn't seem to me to be TEA or many of the school groups understand what happens after an emergency and a catastrophe. Just so you recall, when a hurricane hits, we don't have Wi-Fi, we don't have electricity, we don't have cell phones, we can't even travel. And we need to set up a better system on how you find teachers, because they can't find themselves as well in a hurricane. And we got to have ISDs that know how to do that. Second, I am very concerned about recapture. I think it's become discriminatory, not helpful. We have too many ISDs and schools on the coast that are absolutely being punished to the point of bankruptcy. So I'll be looking forward to this committee hearing process on TEA and your ideas on making sure recapture schools can teach and not be closed. The other thing is windstorm reimbursement. This is ridiculous what the coast, unlike most of the people on this committee, we're being bashed and hit. And most of our school money goes to be paying insurance to the point they can't teach, they can't operate. So I'm going to be wanting your office to work with us on windstorm insurance reimbursement. To me, that is extremely impactful, and for those on this committee, that is sometimes the biggest part of the budget that you have hit with on the coastline. And then the final is, we all talk about education and we want to help you, but I also want my coastal zone and the schools of Texas to be able to operate. When you have a hurricane hit, the school districts are being punished because third parties are overdoing open records requests for vendor information, and they're under timelines, and school districts can't comply, and then they're being punished. So we do need to look at a situation when you have a wildfire, you have a situation with a hurricane, a windstorm, a hailstorm, where schools that cannot operate but aren't going to have to lose their education, affordability, availability. And right now I've got problems on the coastline where safety of kids and families are happening because they can't get insurance. So half the buildings can't be covered. So I want you to know some of my issues. I think Chairman Buckley knows exactly where I'm coming from on these issues, but I want TEA's help this session because hurricane season starts June 1st. And I want to make sure that everybody in the entire state is helped, not only in the South Texas zone to the coastline, but everybody.
Yes, sir.
But you don't have to provide me the information today, but I'll give you a little bit. I'll be asking these questions for the next several months.
Yes, sir. On one of the four things that you laid out, I'll comment that 2 or 3 years ago we did an analysis of.
Better speak into that mic.
Yeah, this thing went out again. Sorry.
Well, no, I want to hear every word.
2 or 3 years ago, we did an analysis. So again, districts report things under generally accepted accounting principles. And we can kind of see in some aspects of what's in their books. Excuse me. Part of that is reporting property and casualty insurance. This can be where your wind insurance shows up. So we can see all along the Gulf Coast that property and casualty insurance payments are actually materially higher on a per pupil basis than they are anywhere else in the state. So we have evidence of exactly what you're saying. It shows up in the financial reports that districts report to us. We can see. It's not that people don't have property and casualty insurance costs everywhere, but it just does it's materially higher on schools that are relatively close to the coast. We're happy to share that analysis with your office.
I know that, but when it gets to the point you can't educate because of financial costs that are out of control of the schools, we need to make sure that education is first.
Yes, sir.
So you don't have to answer it today. I just like you and all those brilliant people sitting behind you, knowing that I'll be having a list of questions and doing a little reminders throughout this hearing. But you don't have to go through this today. I just want to put it on your checklist, and we'll be there talking. And I appreciate you, Chairman Buckley, but I'll be reminding you too on this. Thank you.
Representative Tallarico.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, I wanted to go back to slide 8. I didn't realize we were going to interrupt you throughout, so I was waiting patiently to the end. I just want to make sure I understand this. So the dotted line is total funding adjusted for inflation. So the bars are not adjusted for inflation. Am I understanding this chart correctly?
Yeah, so you'll notice that that purple line, the first dot in 2010, 2011 is at the exact top of the stack. Everything since then is adjusted relative to that.
Got it. And so I'm looking at the blue bar at the bottom is state funding, total state funding. Those bars are not adjusted for inflation. It's just the purple line.
That's right. I mean, we can do that for you, but
No,
that's not on this chart.
I just wanted to make sure I understood it. So is it fair to characterize, and I can't, necessarily compare the 2010 bar to the 22 bar exactly, but is it fair to say that adjusted for inflation, total school funding is pretty flat since 2010, and that total state funding, what we're in charge of here at the legislature, has declined when adjusting for inflation?
Yeah, I mean, it's up. It's again, I'm trying to read that. I don't know, maybe $200 or $300. So if that's flat, then it's flat. It's up, but it's not like a.
And that's the total
massive change.
funding.
That's total funding.
Now, so state funding,
and then state funding,
which looks like non-adjusted,
I'm trying to bring my
dropped a little,
pen
but
across. It would appear that if you're applying some sort of inflationary adjustment to it, does look like it's a little lower. That's correct.
okay, so that's very helpful. So total funding, relatively flat when you adjust for inflation. State funding, when you adjust for inflation, has declined. And so it seems to be that the local property taxpayers who are paying more than ever to fund our schools, while the state level funding that we're all in charge of is perhaps the lowest it's been in at least a decade, maybe 15 years.
What I would say is I think that blue bar looks real different in the year that we're sitting in, because y'all did $14 billion, $21 billion worth of compression. And so in 2 or 3 months, once we have the data for the 23-24 school year from the last legislative session, that blue bar is going to materially shift upwards on this chart. The gray bar is going to get materially smaller. So I think your statement is perfectly accurate 2 years ago. I think your statement right now might not be accurate, and I need to get that data to you. I just don't have it yet.
And what about the federal funding?
I mean,
Not
federal,
for this.
yeah, so federal funding was way up between 21 and 22, and it will be down. So we would expect about $1,000 per pupil decrease on average statewide, because that was roughly the annualized value of ESSER for the 3 or 4 years that ESSER funding was flowing through the system.
So, we've kind of, Rep. Pinoza and Chairman Hunter have mentioned the impacts in their community. My district is seeing schools that are scheduled for closure in our backyard in the district next door, Leander ISD, one of the fastest growing communities, fastest growing school districts in the state, just announced that they're going to have to cut hundreds of teaching positions because of a lack of state funding. Aldine ISD in Houston is closing 6 elementary schools. Fort Worth ISD is considering closing up to 20 schools. Socorro ISD in El Paso is letting go of 300 teaching positions. Northeast ISD in San Antonio is closing 3 schools. Amarillo ISD is closing 3 schools. Plano ISD is closing 4 schools. I mean, I could go on. It's happening all over the state, and a lot of Texans are really concerned. Do you have a sense at the agency of how many districts are running on deficit budgets as of right now?
No. We can tell after adoption whether someone has adopted a deficit budget. That information comes to us something like 12 to 18 months after the school year is over. So let me talk to our team to see what the most recent budget documents that we have for what budget cycle, and then we can share you the stats for that.
So, I mean, we just talked earlier about how teacher pay, when you adjust for inflation, has declined. Local property taxes are skyrocketing. Schools are closing. I mean, I think there's a sense of crisis in our communities, and it's not just urban, it's not just suburban, it's rural as well. How do you, I know you think a lot about this and you have a statewide perspective. I mean, would you consider this a funding crisis where we are right now, or how would you characterize it?
So one, I would certainly encourage the legislature to put more money into public education. I'm your commissioner of education. I will spend all the money that you give me, and I'll give it to the schools. That's the job that I have statutorily. Two, the individual budgeting situations that a district faces, they swim in a sea of state policy, the same sea that I swim in, and that water can be pushing us, forward or backwards. But there are so many factors that are much more local than they are state. So your budget for public education is generally a per pupil budget. There's some funding that you give that's not per pupil. There's some funding that's authorized that's not per pupil. But most of the funding for public education sort of is based upon students being enrolled and showing up in school. So if you go to that demographic slide that I showed actually about teachers, we stopped growing as a state in terms of our student population about 5 years ago. And what I will tell you is that, again, from my lens, you have districts that are operating in 3 different enrollment environments all over the state. They are growing in enrollment, they are flat in enrollment, and they are declining in enrollment. There's districts in Category A, Category B, Category C. Those districts have to actually have materially different budget practices locally. If I'm in a fast-growing district, I am deliberately overhiring teachers every year, deliberately, knowing full well that there's going to be kids that will show up in the fall. I will get revenue for them in the fall and plan accordingly. And so all your districts around the state that have been used to demographic growth, Leander, for example, that has been used to rapid growth, has adopted a whole bunch of internal operating procedures to significantly overhire their staff relative to their student population, literally every year. And it has always worked well for them. And it works well for them until it doesn't. And one year, they switch from column A to column B, and then one year they switch from column B to column C. And they either do this in advance and they're prepared for it, or it catches them after the fact. But if you have been operating under a sort of fast growth budget posture for 8 years and you switch to flat, your very next year, you are going to have a deficit budget because you have more expenses than you have revenue. And then you are going to have to adjust that by laying off excess staff. So this is one of those things that is sort of highly specific to individual districts. I would say campus closures is even more nuanced. That y'all provide funding, other than the school safety allotment, which is a per campus school safety allotment, y'all provide funding that follows kids. It is pretty rare that you're going to see a school in a otherwise large district that has less than 100 kids in it. You'll find that in a super small rural district, but of course that district's getting more like $25,000 per kid because that's the way the small mid-sized district allotment works. And so if you see a district that has a neighborhood that is depopulated, or the parents have chosen to enroll somewhere else for whatever reason, almost no matter what you do from a state funding perspective, they're likely going to close that school because it's the most effective way to ensure that they have the resources, because you want to have a counselor or a librarian or a music teacher, and if you have 100 kids, you've got that that librarian for 100 kids, or if you have 800 kids, you have the same librarian for 800 kids. So those kinds of decisions are going to be local, and so you're seeing a lot more of the school consolidation or closure decisions now, I think, because of enrollment shifts that are happening all over the state. There are deficit budgets, though, that are caused by other factors, not just enrollment shifts. So the year that we are currently sitting in is the year after ESSER funds stopped. So y'all have increased funding for public education, but the feds cut funding by $1,000 a kid. And so that's a huge source of the current deficit budget posture and or fiscal adjustment, because for 3 or 4 years, districts had an extra $1,000 a kid in their budget. They have staff that were related to that $1,000. If they made one-time expenditures for it, easy peasy, but our evidence shows about half of the money that they received from the feds was used for recurring expenditures, and so that funding got cut. Therefore, you're going to see some budget adjustments that are necessary out of it. So, there's a lot of different factors. One of them is the factor that is before this committee in the appropriations, which is how do you structure entitlement under the foundation school program? You have tax policy questions, how much of that should be state versus local, and then how much do you want to increase it by?
And I think that's the concern, is that all of us are seeing this across our communities, across our districts, all with different enrollment trends, all with different characteristics. And so it suggests that this is a problem statewide across all kinds of communities. I mean, we've always had enrollment changes throughout Texas history, but this is the first time when we're seeing so many districts adopting these deficit budgets, so many of these impacts on our kids and on our teachers. And if I'm looking at this chart, we just said that state funding has declined when it's adjusted for enrollment. And so
that's a tax policy question, because the school districts don't experience a difference between who's sending the money. So what you need to look at is what is the entitlement per kid.
Sure, and we just talked about,
and that's the thing that's up relative to inflation.
Right, we talked about it being relatively flat, even though we've gone through COVID. Our students have so many more needs than they did before, and so if total funding is flat, meaning local property taxes are the ones really shouldering the burden. I mean, just look at this chart and you see how the burden has shifted from the state, which is what we on this dais have control over, to local property taxpayers. And then we've seen all these districts adopting deficit budgets. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is we've heard different officials saying that the state is putting more money than ever before into schools, that we are funding schools at historic levels. Do you feel like that is a fair characterization of what state funding has looked like over the last 15 years?
Yeah, so again, I don't draw the, my area of focus is not tax policy. I'm your Commissioner of Education. So whether it's funded out of property taxes or state revenues, if it's in the entitlement of a district, the district
Well,
receives it. So
what we have control over is state funding, so I'm trying to figure out.
No, you have control over all of it because you set the entitlement. So you allow districts to issue INS debt or not. You
Sure.
allow your school finance, your foundation school program system is not based upon state appropriations. It's based upon entitlement per kid. So the legislature sets. I mean, all independent school districts only exist because the legislature created them. Sure. So this is all under your purview. So, but that being said, it is true that at least up to the year before that we're sitting in, I believe, and I have to verify this with data that's not yet available, but it would be true that districts had the highest level of overall all-time funding, and then it's also true that the year that we're sitting in, they have the highest level of funding authorized by the legislature. But the year that we're sitting in, it's $1,000 less in federal funding. So unless the legislature authorized a $1,000 per pupil increase between last year and this year, you're not going to overcome the cuts that have been caused by Congress through the one-time reduction of funds. So these are all, I think, different questions than is it enough? Are they resourced to accomplish the mission? And so that is, I think, a different question that the School Finance Commission met for a year leading up to House Bill 3, and there is no answer to that question. There is no magic number that makes it enough.
And that's really, I think we're gonna have a robust debate this session about what we need and what districts should have to be able to do the job we're asking them to do. What I'm trying to just get at this first meeting is being able to all agree on the same set of facts about where we're at. And I've looked at this chart, I looked at the teacher pay chart, and the chart looks like it's going up until we adjust for inflation, and then it's going down. And those are two very different realities. And so if we have state officials out there telling the public that the state is putting more money than ever before into public education, or we're at historic highs, to me that feels misleading at best, disingenuous at worst. But so thank you for clarifying. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Allen.
Yes, thank you. I too am concerned about the schools operating in a deficit. It has a big impact on who's running the school districts. Superintendents are coming in and going out. Principals are coming in and going out untrained for various reasons. And what impact do you think that's having on the entire education system?
Well, there was a recent study on the impacts of superintendent turnover, and what it showed is that superintendent turnover is associated with some near-term and immediate decline in student achievement in those districts. I can find that study if you're interested. Turnover is not inherently bad. It kind of depends on who's turning over. So that's when you see turnover writ large increase, it can be a sign that's really deeply problematic. It actually can be a sign that's really quite positive. Kind of, again, it all depends on who's turning over and why.
Okay, on the slide on page 9, where the appropriation for pupil expenditures listed as $15,503. Also, there's a breakdown there of how that money is spent. It gives the illusion that the $15,000 is spent on children. Also, where the breakdown is, you see that already, but the teacher's salary also comes out of that $15,000. Am I right? The teacher's salary is included in that.
I mean, teachers are paid with all of these resources. The orange bar can't be used to pay teachers. The teal and the blue can.
So in reality, exactly what might be going into the classroom? How much?
I mean, it varies in every district. We have financial
An
statements on
average,
districts.
somewhere around, it's like 6,000, 5,000.
I mean, I gotta
It
look at
actually touches the kids.
Well, I mean, you pay for teachers, but you also pay for instructional materials. So if you're only saying teacher salaries, that's pretty easy for us to pool. But like they also, you're buying books that you put in front of the kids too. So part of it, if you tell me what you want me to define as touching the kids, I can tell you how much is being spent on it.
When teachers say I have to spend my money and my personal money to give supplies in the classroom, then about how much of that comes out of their salaries?
Well, if a teacher is spending his or her personal money on school supplies, that's coming out of their salary for sure. That doesn't happen everywhere, and that's going to be highly different based upon different management decisions that some districts make. There's some districts that give teachers an actual, here's a small bucket of money just for whatever school supplies you think are necessary.
And while we're talking about salaries, and we had a discussion a little while ago about new teachers and teachers with experience as it goes up the ladder, that new teachers are paid less and you work it way up, etc. Just a thought, a new teacher pays the same amount for a loaf of bread as an old teacher or an experienced teacher. And so I'd like to see some, well, we do not discriminate. We got to attract teachers in the first place, and then we got to hold them. So you attract the new ones and you hold on to them past the December and past the first year of experience, and the first 5 years is when they really drop out and not come back again. And, from my experience, just for information, I hear a lot of teachers right now are saying they're just waiting. You think the teacher turnover has been great, but the teachers said, I'm waiting my turn. I'm going to have my 30 years or whatever I need to retire in the next 2 years or 3 years, and they're waiting at the gate to retire. Just some information. So you're not going to have the teachers in the classroom that you have now. Because if you say the majority of the teachers that are in the classroom are brand new, and they are falling out by the dozen, okay? So I wanted to make you aware of that. I've done that before, make you aware that no teachers are coming in, and the retired teachers are not coming back, and that's a reality. And those teachers I'm hearing, when I hear retired teachers, is strong. I will never put my foot back in there again. I don't want to do that anymore. And you'll notice when people come to address us, they'll say, I'm a former teacher, and they're happy to say I'm a former teacher. Speaking of money going into the public education system, as I recall, when we last session, we put no money in education, right?
No, that's not entirely accurate.
That's not entirely accurate.
There was a per year $2 billion contingent appropriation that did not get released, but there was a set of appropriations that was worth roughly $1.8 billion per year of additional funding that did get released.
Okay. The COVID money that came into the system, was it $15 million that came in?
It was at least $17 billion that flowed to school systems.
Okay,
directly.
so that money went in,
Yeah.
and then the state took out the portion that it was putting into education, so it actually ended up to be the same amount going into education.
No, ma'am.
Help me with that.
There was at least 16.5 billion. I have to look it up, but there was a whole lot of new money in the system. There was about the state received probably $20 billion net from multiple sources. About $1.5 billion of that was used to offset. Everything else was net new money for schools.
Okay. Now, let's look at the future a little bit. You say you're going to do away with stars. I'm hearing be doing away with
That's what I'm
stars.
hearing. That's what I heard.
Yep, I've heard that too. But we're replacing it with what? It's going to be a star. It's going to be a meteor this time. What is it?
I don't know, ma'am.
It's going to be something.
Well, I carry out the laws of the legislature, so whatever laws y'all pass, I execute.
No, it's going to be something by federal demand.
The feds do require
must have
an
accountability.
assessment in reading and math from grades 3 through 8 once in high school, and they require an elementary, middle school, and high school science assessment.
But let me remind you too, you might have accountability, but every state makes its own accountability system, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so be lenient in the accountability system. We don't want to put ourselves out of business. Let me go into the proposed voucher. I'll make the statements. You don't have to answer to it, okay? The proposed voucher is $10,000 proposed. So when a child walks out to go to the school and takes his $10,000 voucher to the private schools where there are not enough private schools to absorb all of these 5 million kids. So not 5 million kids don't have that opportunity. There's a limit to how much money is going into that, right? So that's not a system for every child. The $10,000, when that child walks out, it gets a $10,000 voucher, but this proposed $15,000 goes with that child too. Amen?
I'm sorry. I'm aware of loosely the language in Senate Bill 2. I don't think it has anything to do with $15,000.
Okay, okay. But when a child, let's do as now. When a child leaves the district, his money walks out with him, right?
So a part of the school finance system that is based upon enrollment and attendance. Part of the school finance system is not. So if a student
that money does not leave with the child.
So again, part of the school finance. What we put on in this year's annual report on slide 7. I don't know if you have a copy of this year's annual report.
Okay.
But on page 7, it gives you an indication as to how different pieces of the school finance system work. So INS, for example, is not an enrollment basis at all. It's sort of it's just money from your taxpayers, and so that money doesn't follow the kid. That money just keeps coming into the district forever. The M&O is in part based upon attendance and enrollment, which you can see in those first 2 chunks, but it's also in part based upon reimbursement or spending, various district characteristics, and then actions that districts take. So some of the money, if a student unenrolls from public school because they move, because they transfer somewhere else, then the district will lose access to, will no longer be funded, because we fund schools based upon the kids that are enrolled. And that's The average M&O per pupil was $10,800 in 23-24. Some of that M&O is enrollment and attendance based, and some of that's sort of other components of M&O.
Okay, but I was under the impression that if a child walks out, went to a charter or a private or a church, if it's not there, the money walks out with the kid.
Not all of it, basically.
Okay, all right. I saw nothing in your report today that addresses achievements, like test scores, how many kids, what percentage of kids passed the reading or the math or the whatever, or the all scores. I saw nothing in your report today.
I typically like to start with that information, so it's on slide 5. You'll see an indication of student outcomes for students in various segments of K-12. And then we also have an entire appendix with a detailed breakdown of performance in various grades and subjects.
Okay. So you know it better than I do, so if you could tell me this past school year, what percentage of overall, just all students passed the STAR? You don't have to you don't have to disaggregate it by
off the top of my head, at so you're using the term passing the STAR. We generally don't think of it in that way. We think of approaching grade level or meeting grade level. On a meeting grade level basis, overall, I would guess half. This is a guess. I would have to look. And then on an approaching grade level basis, I would guess about 75%. If you're interested in just reading, we do have that broken down. It's on slide 39. So kids, 53% of kids were reading on grade level in 2024.
Okay, and I want you to, in my mind, I want to deduct the percentage of kids meeting grade level as opposed to the kids not meeting grade level.
Yeah, 29% of kids did not meet grade level, 24% of kids were approaching grade level. So historically, if you think about the concept of passing, the state has historically defined that passing standard as approaching grade level, which is not the same as being on grade level, but we have a lower standard. And so that's 53 plus 24, or whatever that number is. That's 77. So 77% of kids are approaching grade level in reading.
Okay, that's just reading. Can you just tell me about overall the grade level, overall the grades?
Math is materially worse. And so if I was going to average, if there's 53% of kids on reading, I would say probably about 47% of kids average are on grade level.
40% did not?
Oh, does not meet grade level, I would say probably close to 25%, or what you would think of as materially below grade level.
Okay, 25. One last question for you, please. How do you interpret K through 12 DEI? How do you interpret that?
You talking diversity, equity, inclusion?
Yes.
I generally think of those as engaging in discriminatory behavior, where one race or sex is either favored or disfavored for one reason or another.
Okay.
I think it's a broader term than that, but
and how do you plan to implement that?
We have worked both internally at the agency, and then periodically we will have complaints to ensure compliance with both federal and state law. And if we find people that are out of compliance with them and it's an area of agency oversight, then we usually have some sort of enforcement mechanism to ensure compliance.
Thank you.
Representative Leo Wilson.
I just have a couple questions. Do you have anything that shows us back to teacher retention? Like, when I don't want to be myopic, because I talk to my teachers in my district, but the number one complaint I get is discipline and lack of support for discipline. It's not salary. So do we have anything that, obviously I want to increase teacher salaries, and we intend to do that this session, but do you have like a list of like why teachers leave?
Yeah. The top 3 reasons, and they the number one reason for any one teacher is going to be different than the number one reason for another teacher, just to be clear. But the top three reasons, in no particular order, because I think it's really all true, it's just true for different people, is lack of access to raises, so pay. It is what I would broadly characterize as a bunch of work-life balance conditions. They're asked to do too much without enough supports. Their professional environment is untenable. And discipline. And so these are the sort of top three things that cause people. And that middle category is also, there's like a bunch of subcategories underneath it. And so, you know, some people quit because the job that they have been asked to do and the way that job is structured, it's almost impossible for them to be successful. And they signed up for this because they love kids, and they're not being successful because they're working in an environment that no mortal could be successful, and they quit. Some of it is discipline. So I can't even get to instruction. I can't even get to reading and math because a lack of support for discipline. There's a student in my classroom that was wantonly disrespectful, even with my coaching and redirection, to other students and to me, and disrupted the learning process. I have asked for that student to receive instruction in a different learning environment, and the campus put them right back into my classroom. That's a common disciplinary complaint. And then I signed up for this. Yes, I kind of knew what they were going to pay me, but like I'm not getting any raises. This is ridiculous. And my friends who are not having to spend 70 hours a week working nights and weekends like I am doing, they're already making $20,000 more than I am, and so it's broadly, you know, those three key factors.
Okay, and then back to like school closures, same kind of thing. Do we have like, I know that the birth rate is declining, and that is there a population shift as well in the state of Texas to, urban, rural? Would that be part? I mean, I don't think that we can just say, or that it's fair to say, that funding is the sole reason why we have school closures. And so I don't know, do we have any data that shows that or not that? I mean, I don't know what it is, but I do know if you have a declining enrollment and you have a district that has over forecasted, like you said, they're going to be in trouble. Who is in charge of that forecasting? Does TA do that forecasting
Districts.
For them? Individual districts do that? So school boards are the ones that are forecasting what their future population would be.
Yeah, I'm a former school board member, and the school closure, I went through a school closure process in my district, and it is based upon child enrollment counts. Yes, we pay attention to the overall budget, but the thing driving whether an individual school stays open or closed in a local context is whether students are there. So we do not have, I don't think I have demographic data that shows you whether there's population shifts into one area or out of one area. We get all of our projection data from the state demographer, and so I'm happy to share all the information that we have. Schools themselves do their own attendance projections every 2 years. They submit those to us. That's actually how you fund the Foundation School Program and the Appropriations Act. But I don't have a specific answer for you on.
Does TA assist districts in that forecasting? Do you
Not
have
really.
information or no?
No, I mean, we keep people up to speed on what they have to do and when they have to do it, but this is largely a thing that's, schools have been doing this for 50 years. This is not a new thing for them to project enrollment.
Okay. And then just lastly, too, I absolutely join Chairman Hunter in the Coastal Caucus complaints here. So, but we have a district on the island that's 80% economic disadvantaged students. Most of those are parents that work at the port, they or in a restaurant. This is not a wealthy student population or parent population, yet we are always consistently in the top 10 for recapture.
Recapture payments, certainly on a per pupil basis too.
Yes, and so it's killing us. And then, of course, TWIA and all of the insurance being right there. And people say, well, then don't, work on the coastline. I mean, that's your choice to live there. 40% of our economy comes through my district in the ports, in the oil and gas industries, and the warehouses in Chambers County. I mean, it's a huge economic driver. You can't just say, don't have kids and don't work there,
Yep.
right? I mean, it is a driver for the state, so we have to do something for those coastal school districts to help them. I mean, we can't just say, well, people just all go away and move somewhere else. They are working and they are providing for the state's economy. So I'm 100% with Hunter on that. It's the only remedy for recapture is those districts that are injured to turn around and show their injury as a basis and hopefully come up with a new court decision. I think a lot of people think the legislature can fix this, but that was a court order. So what is the remedy for school districts like mine that have been severely injured and shortchanged because of Robin Hood?
Yeah. That is a very big question. I will try to tackle it in parts. One, as I mentioned to Chair Hunter, we do see cost asymmetry. And so you could address that by adjustments in the foundation school program to increase entitlement in some way targeted at the higher levels of operating costs that exist on the coast. That's just, y'all run this foundation school program, you write an adjustment in the law accordingly. Then but that writ large is, I think, relevant to the recapture conversation. So recapture came about because of a constitutional requirement, state constitutional requirement, to have roughly equalized levels of resources for kids based upon equalized levels of taxing effort. That's in essence the basis for how recapture came into existence. There's a little visual on how recapture works for you in this year's annual report. Because what happens is a school district, first you determine what is your entitlement given the students that you have enrolled. Then you collect property taxes. If that's not enough, the state gives you the extra. If it's more, you're still only entitled to your entitlement. So the state graciously accepts that contribution and distributes it then to other schools in the state of Texas. It actually used to be true that and it's still true under state law, you as an individual school district can sign that agreement bilaterally. You can bypass us and you can just, I'm gonna send all my money just to one other school district. Nobody does that because it's administratively burdensome, so they generally use the recapture mechanism. They used to do that because there used to be a financial incentive for them to do that, but that was eliminated many years ago. So recapture is a function of how you have set entitlement under the foundation school program, how many kids show up and generate that entitlement, and what your property wealth is per pupil. Those are the three variables. And so if you increase entitlement, a district's budget will go up and recapture will go down. If you decrease a district's ability to collect property taxes, you will not increase a district's budget, you will not decrease a district's budget, but recapture will go down. And then if more kids show up in that district, recapture will go down. We think you have some flexibility under court rulings to create some variation from district to district in taxing effort. And in fact, you have already done that. So you have a mechanism that allows some degree of lower tax rates, about 10% lower tax rates in some districts than others. You could potentially increase that flexible band and target it at your recapture paying districts. And that will have the inherent effect of reducing recapture without broadly modifying the school finance system. So I think there are some things that you can do, but to some extent you are constrained by prior Supreme Court ruling. If someone wants to challenge those proceedings, they file a lawsuit and challenge those proceedings and it gets litigated again.
Representative Schoolcraft. Members, just a reminder, we do have another panel. We'll probably recess about 10 minutes before we go to the floor, and we'll have to return after the floor.
Commissioner, back on the deficit budget issue, I've got I have 17 school districts wholly or partially in my legislative district. And of course, last year, as they were starting to adopt budgets, there were a handful that very high publicity, you know, the bad legislature didn't fund us enough, so we're having to adopt a deficit budget. I started trying to dig into that, and what I found every time, those were school districts who had taken their ESSER funds and used them to hire personnel and or start new programs, and they're finding that this year they no longer have that money, but they have the continuing expenses, and that was leading to the deficits. Is that a significant problem around the state?
Yeah, I would say that's probably the dominant cause of deficit budgets in the year that we're in.
Okay. And real quickly on recapture, because there's a lot of discussion about that around here. Robin Hood, which was, you know, that was a name given to recapture, and the theory behind that, people think it means take from the rich districts to give it to the poor districts. In my view of that, is really take from the rich districts so that we don't have to equalize up to their level of funding, i.e. if they can generate $50,000 for $1 of effort, we would have to equalize so that every school district in the state would have $50,000 per student. So isn't it really kind of, might help some members to realize that, sure, we get some recapture money, but that whole thing is not about redistributing the money. It's about giving a haircut to the very wealthy districts so that we don't have to equalize up to their level of funding, because that would probably take 10 times the whole state budget to equalize up to that level.
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization. I might offer one asterisk, which is property wealthy. As she was speaking, I'm assuming you're talking about High Island, but as she was speaking, the demographics of students that are enrolled in the district could actually still be quite low income, but it could be a very property wealthy location.
Right. It's all targeted property wealth.
That's right.
I think. Right. Right. Okay.
Chairman Dutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things we haven't talked about is district fund balances. What's the status of that?
We can get you the most recent report, but they've been steadily going up, and this is not an accident. We've actually advised people. So back to the federal funding picture. When the ESSER funds came, they were it was very unusual. The feds basically allowed you to put the money in the bank. It wasn't direct; it's very indirect. But it's a provision called supplant or supplement. And normally you can't supplant state funds with federal funds, but in this case you could. And if districts did a specific set of accounting practices, which were allowed, they could end up reducing their what they spent out of state entitlement M&O and use federal funds for that, and then they would be able to increase their fund balance accordingly. So there is some increase in fund balance that has occurred because districts have been sort of somewhat wise and fiscally restrained during this one-time money from the feds, and they didn't spend it all, and instead they put some away so they could spend it slowly, in which case you would actually expect them to operate a deficit budget, because that's what you did. You put it away to spend extra. All that being said, I think we're at least $21 billion statewide. I'd have to give you the real number, and I could be wrong on that. That's the number I'm doing from memory. I don't remember with clarity.
Does the state dictate anything about district fund balances?
I would describe the state incentivizes a particular approach to fund balance. So we give districts A through F financial accountability ratings. It's called the FIRST rating system. And you get points for various things. And you get the most points if you have at least 3 months, I think, 90 days worth of funds in your fund balance. So we incentivize higher points in that particular A through F system for having 90 days worth of fund balance, or 90 days worth of your district operating expense sort of in your savings account, as it were. Now, you can still get an A in the financial accountability system and have zero fund balance, but most districts look at that 90 days as their target.
And let me ask this. One of my constituents sent me this and said, do we ever evaluate student outcomes on the basis of certified and non-certified teachers?
Sure do. In fact, we did very recently. So that's the second to last page in this report that shows there's a much higher percentage of uncertified teachers at campuses that would have otherwise performed in the F performance band than campuses that otherwise perform in the A performance band. So
Which one is
page
it?
58, the very second to last page in this entire handout.
Oh, I see. And, I'll talk to you about it.
Representative Cunningham.
Thank you, Chairman Buckley. Commissioner Morath, just one question, because I know time is of essence. How much do we know about the impact of a 4-day school week on student learning?
It's bad. Data is pretty unequivocal. So we have I think actually we released a research report on this yesterday, looking at Texas school districts that have done it. There's a bunch of national research on it, and you should expect less student learning when there's a 4-day school week switch. It's not universally true. There are places that are able to make an adjustment like this under a high degree of controlled conditions that don't see backsliding in student outcomes, but that's the exception, not the rule.
You said the report was released yesterday?
Yeah, I think this report's now up on our website because we did an analysis of STAR scores over the last couple of years with 4-year school weeks, and the relationship is statistically significant, and it reduces reading and math performance.
All right. Thank you, Chairman.
Vice Chair Bernal.
Thank you. Thanks for spending time with us. I know it's not easy with all of us asking lots of questions, and you've got to know everything at the top of your head. Also, you had someone there with you who's bringing you data, whatever her name is. She's great, and, give her a raise. But I'm fascinated by, I wonder if you could add some depth for me. I'm fascinated by this slide that we keep going back to on 58. I think it's one of the more telling slides. I mean,
Yes, sir.
in terms of a beacon for us to focus some of our work this session. I know it's not perfect, but generally my experience has been that accountability scores and concentrated poverty there is some relationship there, right? And so what this slide also tells me is that in a lot of our campuses with the greatest need, there is a tremendous clustering of, let's call it, inexperience, right? And so part of our task, I think, is to find a way in short order to unwind that or unbind it,
Yep.
right? Because there's never any other circumstance where you take tremendous need and then decide to infuse it with inexperience, right? But to then go back to the original slide, with the, I guess it's on slide 14.
Yes, sir.
It looks to me, and this is a question. I'm not making a point, except that this is a good North Star for us this session. If you compare 2014 and 15 to 23, 24, it looks like, and I'm wondering if you know there to be a relationship between traditionally certified teachers and uncertified. In other words, it seems like when there are more traditionally certified teachers, that the number and the percent of uncertified is much, much smaller, that they're taking up much more space.
I must have missed the question. I'm sorry. Say that one more time.
Well, I guess what I'm asking is if you compare 2014 and 2023.
Yes, sir.
Right? The number of uncertified teachers in 23-24 is massive.
Right.
Or the percent is massive. And the number of certified teachers or the percent is much smaller. What I find interesting is that in 2014 and 15, the percent of certified teachers is significantly larger but the uncertified is tiny.
Right.
And I'm wondering if,
It wasn't allowed prior to then.
so we opened the floodgates and then they all.
I believe the law was passed in 2015. Prior to that, charter schools were authorized to, but not required to. They could employ an uncertified teacher. And then prior to 2015, you had to go through a whole bunch of hoops and get special permission to have an uncertified teacher.
That's right. And have you noticed in all the different seats that you occupy, the effect that that may have had on the schools of ed themselves, their enrollment, their production, et cetera?
I don't know that was causal in reducing enrollment in undergraduate college of education. I can believe it might have been. I just don't know. I am, however, much more confident that I think this is causal to the stagnation in performance of students writ large during the same time period. The legislature has made a ton of very specific historic investments in 2019, and of course COVID came along. You've made substantive policy improvements in a whole bunch of areas, but one, we had COVID, which is a huge distortion, but two, we've been swimming in this sea of steadily reducing student access to people prepared to teach.
Got it.
And even if you had great curriculum in all the schools, which as we talked extensively about last session, you do not, and that is probably in the process of getting fixed. The curriculum doesn't teach itself. You have to have highly skilled educators doing this. And so this is I do think this is a huge challenge, and I'm excited you all have asked so many questions about this hearing.
Agreed. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chairman.
Members, any more questions?
One more.
All right, Representative Schoolcraft.
Commissioner, this is a really interesting chart. I think this is the percentages of the newly hired teachers each year. Is that correct?
Yeah, and in fact, it's slightly narrower than that. This is new to teaching, newly hired.
New to teaching, okay.
So the end count is about 30,000 teachers.
Could you all provide a similar chart that shows the teaching force for each year and what the percentages are and how that changes?
How they came from? Yeah, that's right. Because we're at as you can see, the first year new to hire was 56% uncertified. The total teaching workforce is currently about almost 11% uncertified.
So that's growing.
Yeah,
okay.
This is feeding into the entirety of the pie.
All
But
right.
we can do a holistic analysis of all 380,000 teachers for you and how did they get certified.
That would be great. Thank you.
All right, members, any more questions? All right, thank you, Commissioner. You are up next again, but you need to stretch your legs. You can stretch them. We'll start with 2 of the 3 of the tri-agency heads. Next on our agenda is an update on the